Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. We've received apologies from Mark Griffin MSP, Willie Coffey MSP and Fulton McGregor MSP. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny on the reform of energy performance certificates. And we're joined in the room by Professor David Jenkins, who's a Professor of Energy and Buildings at Heriot-Watt University, and Alan Stark, who's the Chair of Sustainability and Building Design Committee at the Property Federation. And we're joined online by Gillian Campbell, who's the Director of the Existing Homes Alliance, and Andy Parkin, who's the Technical Development Director at Elmhurst Energy. Now, I welcome our witnesses to the meeting. We've got around 90 minutes for this discussion. There's no need for you to operate your own microphones, and members will direct their questions initially to someone in the first instance. But if you'd like to come in, please indicate to myself or the clerks, or if you're online, please type an R in the chat function. I don't feel you necessarily need to come in on every question. So I'm going to start. So I guess a scene-setting question that will come maybe to all of you, and David, I'll direct it to you in the first instance. So just a general sense of where we're at, the need to reform the EPC system. So it's something that's been going on for quite a long time. We know that that was a direction from the Climate Change Committee, and we've been at this since 2017. But so your sense on the need to do this reform and your overall views on the Scottish Government's broad approach.
Yeah, thank you. So energy performance certificates are traditionally quite sort of conservative documents. They have this requirement for standardisation, and it's meant in the past they've probably not been changed very much. So there's various assumptions varying from the building physics to the way it's actually applied that needs an update to accommodate new technologies, new uses, and just the access that we now have to different software, different techniques to do a better job of EPCs. So I think the call for refreshing how we generate EPCs and how we use EPCs is a sensible one. So the drive there's plenty of evidence behind that. The reforms themselves that have been proposed, I mean, obviously we'll go into the detail I expect later on, but I think there's some quite sensible suggestions in terms of improvements that we can make. There's some improvements that are being influenced by what's happening with across the UK, because we obviously share certain processes with the rest of the UK. And also there's a lot of change going on across Europe, and we should remember this is a document that is European in genesis, and so there's lots of other countries also kind of navigating their own changes. So we've got this kind of sort of sea of change really around EPCs, so that's potentially good. Some of the reforms that have been proposed by Scottish Government respond to that very well. Some of them, I think, as we'll discuss, we probably need a bit more caution and a bit more care. But the case for change is certainly a strong one.
Great, thanks. Alan, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I think we agree, our members certainly agree that there is a need to change the system. It's not very accurate. What I would say about the current system is it's generally consistent, so everybody knows where they stand in terms of their properties. Mm-hmm. In tiers, that calculation might not be exactly right, but it generally works in a tiered system. Right. I think the big concern is that whatever new system comes out, we don't really know what that's going to be and or look like, and what impact it's going to have, because properties at the moment that are at C and above might suddenly not be at C. Mm. So there's a huge concern that however we recalculate it could have a big impact. Right. And I think it's important that there is some time allocated to introducing this new system, that it's thoroughly tested first before it's thrust upon every property. Mm.
Okay, great. Thanks. Gillian, have you got anything to add?
I suppose that the existing systems, I think it's universally agreed that reform has been needed for some time. In the existing system, it doesn't, the information on the EPCs is often limited. So thinking about it from a consumer's point of view, it doesn't present accurate information on the energy efficiency of the home or energy costs. As energy costs don't respond to changing energy pricing, for example. So the current system isn't giving homeowners or tenants sufficient information to make informed decisions, so they're really not fit for purpose from the consumer's point of view, particularly in terms of net zero and decarbonising our heating systems. Thinking about the proposals coming forward, the Existing Homes Alliance welcomes the proposed revisions to the EPC system. As was alluded to earlier, this has been a long time coming, and there is broad consensus that the current system isn't fit for purpose. We do welcome the proposal to provide clearer information through the proposed new ratings, and particularly welcome the inclusion of a heat retention rating, setting out how much heat is needed to maintain a set temperature. I think what I'd be keen to also point out at this point is that reforming EPCs is absolutely essential. And as I said, is likely to be welcomed across the board. But we do need to remember that reforming EPCs is a means to an end, and not an end in itself. Reformed EPCs will help owner-occupiers, tenants and landlords to better understand the energy efficiency of their properties. But that's meaningless unless they are enabled then to act on that information. And so we must remember, it's great that we're making progress on reform EPCs, but it is a small part of a bigger picture.
Okay. And that bigger picture connects into the work on heating buildings that's coming. Is that part
Absolutely.
of it?
So alongside the EPC system, we need a robust framework of advice and support. So that people know where to go when they do want to upgrade their homes, so that they can act on the information they're getting through their EPCs. We also need a range of financing mechanisms and incentives so that improving energy efficiency and switching to clean heating is an attractive and affordable option. And we do need policy clarity, as you alluded to there, in terms of the forthcoming Heating Buildings Bill. Time is passing, but we do still need a clear sort of regulatory framework through a Heating Buildings Bill and through also the social housing net zero standard, so that landlords, homeowners and critically the supply chain can see what's coming down the line and factor that into investment decisions.
Okay, thanks. Andy, do you have any views on the reform of the EPC system and the government's approach?
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak today. That's it's fantastic that I've been invited. I can't really add much more to what's already been said. I think the comments there are absolutely right on. Just from a member's perspective, because we represent somewhere in the region of about 2,000 energy assessors in Scotland, and they have to go on this journey as well. We can't lose sight that the energy assessors are the practitioners, they're the ones applying the methodology, they're the ones interacting with the consumer, with the customers, and they need to be brought along on the journey as well. So wherever there is change, we have to plan that in, and we have to understand that the pace of change and the amount of change within that period of time is also significant. We're not just talking about reforming EPCs here, we're talking about methodology changes as well, along with regulation that's going to change at the same sort of time. So plenty to do, and Elmhurst and the other schemes that are involved in the EPB are all in place to do it. We just need to know what's happening in good time and have plenty of time to implement those changes with our members.
Okay, so given that, I'm going to bring in my next question, and I'm going to stick with you. And I'd be interested to hear from an assessor's point of view what your views on the three sets of ratings that the Scottish Government intends to display on the EPC: the heat retention rating, the heating system rating, and the energy cost rating, and how will assessors work with that?
I think it's quite a difficult question to answer without getting to sort of the way that the methodology will work as well, because I think it's sort of akin to, without getting a bit trite.
You feel welcome to get into the methodologies, because my next question was going to be your views on the assessment methodology. So take it all as a package.
Okay, so we understand that HEM is going to be the next methodology that comes in. Currently, we use SAP and RDSAP, without losing sight that there's commercial methodology in SPEM as well and DSM. But the core of that is much of what is going to be done from an on-site perspective or from a data collection and data entry perspective is going to change. So that's the first thing that assessors will need to sort of understand. Then it's also how the methodology and the calculation will proceed and what makes the differences, where the tolerances are, where the methodology differs from the current versions of SAP and RDSAP. And then understanding how that manifests itself within the metrics that are being displayed on the EPC. It is akin to sort of, I say this a lot, but it's kind of like if we're skateboarding down a hill, we know where we're going. We know we need to get to the bottom of the hill, but we don't know what's coming down the line unless we're fully informed about what's changing in the methodology. That's just the methodology. If you're then talking about a new EPC with new metrics on it, that's kind of like adding another skateboard on top. So we're sort of, everything's moving around at the moment, and we've got to be able to get our members to understand each piece individually and then make sense of it as a package. And that's quite difficult to do right now because we don't know enough about what is changing. There's still quite a lot of things up in the air, particularly around the HEM methodology. I think it's fair to say we haven't got conventions. We haven't got a static set of data points at this moment in time, although that's pretty close now. So there's quite a bit to do there. I'm also very sympathetic about any member who is sort of cross-border, because and we do have a number that do work in Scotland and in England. And when you've got two different kinds of EPCs to work with, that's quite a difficult thing to sort of work with, handling two different reports and two different outputs at the same time.
So what will happen though? Will they be? Is it you or somebody else who offers the training programs for them to develop that, and what kind of time? Because you said in your in your response to my first question that they need time. So what are we looking at here in terms of the training and development there?
Yeah, our members are used to upskilling and absorbing new information. Either that's through ongoing CPD or in form of an upskill or retraining program. Anybody who's been around since the beginning of EPCs has experienced that over that period of time. And in case of domestic energy assessors, there's been a complete change to the national occupational standards. We will probably need somewhere in the region of 6 months in order to take what's changing, write material, and then roll that out to our membership. And there will be those that do it early, and then there'll be those that sort of fall into line later on. The question sort of remained, do we need to make that more of a mandated piece of training, or is that something else that can be done sort of more passively through things like CPD? I rather suspect it's got to be the former because the changes are significant. But I think 6 months is kind of what we need. I think we have a decent enough understanding of the direction of travel, but we definitely need confirmation on things like the HEM methodology. And then what happens with RD-HEM? I hate to use the phrase because it's not an official term, but the existing domestic version of the home energy model, if we are going to change the assessment procedure, that moves things further, and we need to be sort of mindful of that as well. It will be the schemes that roll out the majority of the training. That's fair to say, but there are other training providers out there, and of course they will want to do the same thing for energy assessors. So yeah, we need to bring everybody into the same place.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Good to get a sense of the time to move it from something that comes through in regulations to then actually people being able to work with it. Maybe, David, do you have any thoughts on these ratings and the assessment of
Yeah, I have some concern. I'm going to maybe mention quite a lot of European work because, again, there's a number of European countries looking at what's sometimes referred to as next-generation energy performance certificates. So the idea that you might try to get more information on an EPC or different information, different output metrics on an EPC. And what some of that research has shown is that we're sometimes a bit too keen to put extra things on an EPC just because we can. We haven't necessarily thought about why we want that extra information. And the problem with extra information, particularly with a very sort of static EPC document, is that you can quite quickly cause information fatigue on the user of that document. So you need a really clear reason, a really clear rationale. Why do you need a heat retention rating? What's that going to do that the EPC currently doesn't do? And I'm not clear, but particularly with the 3 ratings that have been proposed, I'm not really clear how those ratings will be kind of game changers in terms of people actually going through with action on their buildings as a result of those new output metrics. And that's the thing we should be focusing on. Is one of the main problems with EPCs at the moment is that the EPC process finishes and that's it. Nothing happens after that point. So there's this kind of missing bridge between the end of the EPC and tradespeople actually coming into buildings and doing things. So when we do add these extra output metrics onto EPCs, if that's what's being proposed, there needs to be a really clear demand for that particular output metric. Who's told us that they need this information? What evidence do we have that that information will actually stimulate action that's not currently being stimulated? I'm not convinced across all the output metrics that have been proposed for new EPCs that's really the case. And again, there's lots of European projects, Horizon-funded European projects, that have done their own versions of next-generation EPCs, tested out different bits and pieces, produced new draft EPCs, and you often get these documents that are just full of information, and you imagine your typical householder picking up that document, what are they going to do with that? A slight caveat with that is that one of the kind of positive proposals with the reform of EPCs is to change how we interface with EPCs. So an EPC in modern day, there's no reason why an EPC should just be a static document, right? A PDF or a paper document. And we see UK government have an option to access England and Wales EPCs through an online interface, a fairly simple one, but it means that as an end user of an EPC, you can start to filter out the information that's more important to you and maybe reduce this issue of information fatigue. But you still want those available output metrics need to be tailored to some kind of demand, some kind of need. I'm not sure we've quite got that right in terms of what's been proposed.
Okay, but so what do you think? What would you propose?
So I think the current EPC, the generation of that standardised EPC rating is broadly fine. We can talk about some of the improvements behind it that's necessary. I think from that point onwards, we need to find a way of just pointing householders to very practical information about what comes next. So installers, practitioners, tradespeople.
So the bridge.
And we have to accept that within an EPC, you might have something in a recommendation in there that's very bland and very broad, but it needs to be enough to push that person towards a professional who can then give more detailed and tailored advice, because EPCs are not about being tailored. They're all about being average and generic. That's their job. We can criticise them for being too generic, but to some extent that is their job, to be very kind of averagey, very, very generic. So I think we need information in the EPC to take people on, to hold people's hands to the next step.
Right, okay.
And some of the work that's been going on with building renovation passports, building renovation pathways, again, across Europe, I think that's the kind of work that we need to be reflecting on.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else got anything to add to this?
So
Gillian?
I agree with what's been said, that well, two things. Firstly, the assessors need time, because not only do they need to understand what's required of them and how to turn that into an EPC, but also every property is going to have to be reassessed. So that's going to take a bit of time.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure we've got the EPC right and then roll it out, and that's going to take quite a bit of time. But as David says, what's on the EPC, I think it's very helpful if it can be something that points in a direction. I mean, the current one gives you very vague ideas about what you can and can't do, but that in itself is very helpful, because it lets the end user or owner say, well, if I do that, this is what will happen. And I think that's where there is a huge gap, that we don't know the kind of insulation type modifications are all a bit vague, and we don't want to end up going down the wrong route again that happened in the past. So we need to be clear that those modifications that are being suggested are actually tried and tested as well, and not just thrust and rolled out and then find we spent a whole load of money to achieve absolutely nothing.
Yes. Yeah. Great. Gillian?
Thanks. Yeah, just I'd quite like to build on some of what David Jenkins was saying there, actually, about the sort of format of this certificate. I think we welcome the fact that it's proposed to look at something that's maybe web-based, but I think it really does need to be a kind of dynamic model that can be updated and is usable by the end user. If we've got a fixed assessment that doesn't reflect the real world, it doesn't reflect costs, real world costs or emissions. Both the heating system efficiency rating or carbon rating essentially, and the cost rating, they would not reflect the real world. In terms of carbon intensity of the heating system, for example, this will be affected by the decarbonisation of Scotland's grid, which will change over time. And in terms of the cost rating, as we know, as we've seen over the last few years, the cost of electricity and gas are hugely volatile and will change. So both of these metrics will be out of date incredibly quickly unless it's a dynamic system that allows the end user to add current data to get a real-time assessment. Also really interested and very supportive of the idea that the EPCs should be seen as a kind of stepping stone towards a building renovation passport or logbook type approach as a means of improving how we manage and maintain our homes. As David said, that's something that is being explored across Europe. And these are sort of comprehensive long-term planning documents that can include a digital logbook, recording work as it's done, plus a long-term renovation plan, renovation roadmap, setting out sort of future measures for retrofit, along with links to contractors, links to finance options. So there's a huge amount of opportunity here to make it something that's dynamic, that's something that's usable for the consumer, and actually delivers action rather than just being a sort of snapshot in time.
Okay, great. That's very interesting. The whole dynamic thing, online dynamic, that can be responsive to changing metrics and also what's also like financing options that come online. I'm now going to bring in Evelyn Tweed with some questions. Evelyn.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel, and thanks for your answers so far. They've been very helpful. To follow on from what we've been talking about so far, do you feel the proposed new system will provide sufficient information to building owners to incentivise energy efficient improvements and reduce emissions from their heating systems? So this notion that it should be dynamic, you know, people should be looking at it, wanting to do things. The system as it's proposed, is that going to do it? And I'll maybe come to Gillian first, if that's okay.
Yeah, great, thank you. It's a really important question because, as I said at the start, the EPCs are just a part of the picture. They're not an end in itself, they are just a means to an end. And that's where I think actually having clear information there that the consumer understands is the first step. So there's a whole process about communicating and making sure that the reader of the assessment understands what they're being told there. And I think there is a real risk at the moment that the concept of a heat retention rating, for example, which I think is actually incredibly important for giving the homeowner the understanding of the heat demand for the building, so what's and actions in terms of what they can do to reduce that heat demand. It's a new concept to the vast majority of homeowners, tenants, and in many cases landlords. And there's a real risk of confusion there, especially if we've got another metric that's called a heating system metric. So there's a real issue there about the use of the word heat in different contexts, and so I think that's a bit of a challenge. Someone mentioned earlier the risk of people operating across the UK as well, which I think is a challenge. There's always a sort of communications challenge there when we've got slightly different terminology and different systems across the different nations. I think the UK government is proposing talking about a fabric performance rating rather than a heat retention rating. So we've got different parts of the UK talking different languages and assessors operating across the UK. That's potentially confusing to the end user, to the consumer. But back to the point, your question, which was about does it incentivise action? I think this is where it needs to have clear links. Whatever this web-based or dynamic system is, it needs to have clear links onto follow-on advice. So this document tells you where you are right now, makes recommendations in terms of what you can do, but critically what to do with that information. And I think this is one of the big barriers we face at the moment. Homeowners know they have to do something, but they don't know what that something is or who can help them. So that's where it needs to be aligned with an expanded Home Energy Scotland service, for example, so they can pick up increased referrals, increased inquiries for action, but then potentially alongside Home Energy Scotland, we need locally based one-stop shops or retrofit agencies that people can, homeowners can go along to this one-stop shop and say, look, I've got this, I don't know what to do next. And the one-stop shop can guide them through that process of understanding what works for them, helping them to develop their long-term retrofit plan and actually act on what the certificate is telling them.
Thanks. Andy, I think you indicated you wanted to come in.
There we go. I can't unmute myself, so that's thank you. Yeah, I was just to sort of echo the points around the dynamic aspects of the EPC. This is something we've long called for. It makes absolute sense. Your EPC is set by the date that it's been lodged, and it uses the fuel prices and the carbon emission factors in place at the time, and that is set in two ways. Once in the methodology, and then the other is any figure that's quoted in terms of costs or savings. That's a more recent number, and there's confusion in that aspect in the minds of the consumer and also in other stakeholders in the industry. That's really only just being talked about and appreciated now. So if we are going to create a dynamic EPC, we need to understand what we want from that and what does that mean. I'd be very cautious about having an EPC that changes from one day to the next, or it is truly dynamic in that respect, because as we know, there's policy and there's regulation coming where having a rating at a certain time is key. So it needs to be sort of the next step from the EPC, the static EPC that you've got. I want to then compare that to where I'm at now. I want to see if the fuel prices have changed, or if the carbon emissions have changed. So we need to make that a part of the journey. The consumer needs to be able to appreciate that. So I agree with everything that Gillian was saying there. I think it needs to also do sort of four things. It's the what should I do? It's the why should I do it? Sort of what will I get from doing that? And who can I trust to help me? And that goes back to what Gillian was saying there as well. Having that sort of next stepping stone. I want to really avoid that assumption that the EPC can do everything for everybody in a particular format, because it can't, and it has been the victim of that over the years. It was brought in for a particular purpose. That purpose has moved on. The EPC hasn't moved on. So we have got to commit to educating all stakeholders in what it does, and then what the next steps for that data, for that report is. And I think the interoperability of data, particularly moving into digital logbooks or into a retrofit program, is absolutely essential. And again, that's something that I think is going to have to come out as we get closer to a launch for the HEM and for the reduced data version of it.
Okay, thanks. Alan.
Yeah, I think to answer Evelyn's question, I think the EPC, if it gives the right level of information, will be an incentive to people to improve their properties. I think most people want to improve their properties, but they need to know what that improving is going to achieve for them. Is it going to reduce their running costs? Is it going to make the property worth more? There's always got to be a what am I going to get from this? Mm-hmm. And also the cost is the huge issue, because I think if there's grants or loans or something made available, that might incentivise people to push on and do something. If it's down to you, you can do it, but you're going to have to pay for it all. That might be a bit disincentive.
David.
Yeah, just to build on that point. I mean, when we did, in terms of whether this will incentivise action, when we did have particularly high rates of, for example, cavity wall insulation being installed, the EPC was quite heavily involved with that, and it did signpost people towards grant schemes. But obviously, a large part of that incentive was, at that time, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, loft insulation and cavity wall insulation was, in some cases, free or very, very low cost because of the grant schemes. So you had this combination of reasonably useful information in the EPC, particularly directing you towards a grant scheme or investigating a grant scheme, and the fact that you're aware that that grant scheme exists. So we don't have such, on some insulation measures, we don't have quite the same sort of generous funding landscape, particularly for householders right now. We have some quite significant schemes around things like heat pumps. So it's difficult to talk about incentivisation without making sure that the information in the EPC is paired with a well-structured grant or financial supporting mechanism, which right now it's not. So that's obviously a key point. And then to sort of repeat an earlier point, incentivisation means that something from the EPC needs to go through a next step, which becomes more tailored, because it's difficult to incentivise somebody on a single sentence in a recommendation list, cavity wall insulation. The hand still needs to be held through to later steps. Otherwise, that action won't happen.
Can I just come in on a quick supplementary on that one? So do you think the grant schemes need to be technology neutral, so there's more flexibility in what people could use rather than just this focus around air source heat pumps? Could that help?
Not necessarily technology neutral, and I'm all for incentivising installation of heat pumps. And actually, some of our scheme looks kind of quite generous for funding that, but there's other countries that are actually more generous around supporting heat pump grants. So yeah, I don't know whether technology neutral is the right word, because I mean, energy performance certificates should be giving us that first step into telling us what technology should be installed, not just for that individual house, but across the stock. If the model's working even on a very sort of basic level, it starts to tell us the technologies that are likely to have maximum impact on people's energy bills and on carbon emissions. So it's not, I wouldn't say technology neutral, but we need to broaden the scheme, and we need to look at the successes we've had in the past on insulation schemes. They also had issues and flaws, but they had some successes in terms of actually getting technology, getting materials into buildings. And we're in quite a different landscape now in terms of number of installations of low energy technologies into buildings.
Okay, thanks. So Evelyn, I'm going to come back to you just to say Andy wanted to come in on that, so maybe you can direct your next question and he can wrap in his whatever he wanted to say.
Do with this one anyway, so that fits quite nicely. Andy, do you feel the new system will adequately allow for differences in building type and geographical area to be fully taken into account?
So there's two aspects to that question. The geographical side of things, so SAP has historically been calculated on a single point in the country, to allow an EPC in in the Outer Hebridean Islands to be compared to an EPC in Glasgow. But clearly there are differences between those two locations, and I think that they have to be taken into consideration. I don't see any particular issue with being able to compare EPCs on an Outer Hebridean island with another EPC in the same geographical location. Similarly for Glasgow or Edinburgh, and there will be differences when you do that, and I think that's fine. I think really the priority is to ensure that anybody looking at that EPC is getting more accurate and correct information. And as much as anything, it should also be about those recommendations. And this is the point I was going to try and wrap in, is the recommendations currently on EPCs are what they are. They're driven by something called Appendix T. They're a bit blunt. They only occur when certain scenarios are in place, and they're probably not aligned very well with what we're trying to achieve in terms of decarbonised heat, etc. The challenge there is that they tend to be very safe recommendations, and that's okay. But I'll give you, for instance, we're already measuring areas of walls because we're also measuring areas of windows. So by virtue, you subtract one from the other, and you get your areas of walls. And if we're going to apply material to that wall to insulate it as part of a recommendation, we should have a fair idea of how much material is required, and therefore regionally how much that should cost to apply to a building. These are still estimates, but they are so much better to be able to take that information and get a more accurate estimate of cost than just have a very, very blunt table in the back end of the methodology that says, oh, cavity wall is going to cost you £1,000. It probably won't, because you're not thinking about your wall area. You're not thinking about your geographical location. So I would be really, really supportive of enhanced recommendations appearing initially on the EPC, and then further enhancement if you choose to vary that in a way. So looking at a particular kind of heat pump or a different level of insulation. We should be able to do that dynamically, but it has to come from the information you put into the EPC, not a sort of a very, very safe assumptive position as your starting point. I hope that makes sense. That's quite a complicated route through, but I think it is both property specific and geographically specific, and getting better recommendations is so important in terms of adoption of what the EPC is trying to put in front of the consumer.
Julian, you indicated you want to come in.
Thanks, yes. So I was keen just to quickly jump back to the question about whether EPCs will do enough to incentivise action. And I think, to be honest, the answer is no, they won't, because they're a tool to help people to take action and understand what the starting point is and what it is they need to do, but they will not drive the action. I think what will drive the action is an awareness of the benefits of investing in upgrading your insulation and installing measures and clean heat and so on. The benefits in terms of running costs, in terms of air quality, tackling damp and mould, reducing improving health of the occupants of the building. So the starting point is people need to understand why there is a case for action. Secondly, it needs to be affordable to people. That's in terms of the upfront costs of the measures, and in part that's addressed through having the right sort of grant system, but it's also about having other financing mechanisms that can support any remaining cost to the homeowner. So whether that's low-cost loans, long-term financing, or there's a number of different models around there, like property-linked finance, for example. So mechanisms that help it to become affordable. Also affordable in terms of running costs, not just upfront costs. So if we're talking about clean heat, running costs is a major barrier, and that's where we do need the UK government to take action urgently on rebalancing electricity and gas prices. The third thing that needs to happen for people to take action is around making the process easy. And that's going back to the point I was making earlier about working alongside Home Energy Scotland, having these one-stop shops or retrofit agencies, the right kind of advice and support so people can take their EPC and say, right, I want to do something, I think I can afford it because there's all these financing mechanisms available, I know why I want to do it, therefore you help me on my journey to upgrade my home.
Okay. Briefly, David.
Just on the geographic element, so we could do that already if we wanted to with the current SAP model. We could alter climatic regions within Scotland and within the UK. The reason we don't isn't because of any kind of flaws or limitations with the modelling. It's just the standardisation requirement. It makes it easier to have that kind of common climate. But we could make that argument. I would trust the new home energy model a bit more to deal with variation in weather data. Slight issue with that is that it can be a bit of a Pandora's box, because actually if you look at the effect of location on the energy use of the building, obviously north and south is really important, but we see quite significant differences in terms of the altitude of the location and the proximity to the coast. Mm-hmm. So if we are going to go into that kind of a level of detail, do we need to include these factors as well, because that can have a big impact on heating consumption in particular. But I think there's a reasonable argument that there could be more geographic and climatic variations within the model, and probably the home energy model will do a better job of that than SAP. But we could do it right now if we wanted to.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay.
To the next one.
Yep.
So for my last question, can you offer your views on the proposed new non-domestic metrics and assessment? Who would like to kick off with that?
I can't give you the detail because I don't know what the detail is, but I would say as a general statement that the non-domestic is complicated because often the tenant does the fit out and its end use has a huge impact on whatever rating that's going to be. So I can see the non-domestic is actually a very difficult animal to deal with, just because there's too many unknowns until a tenant comes on board and then decides what the fit out is going to be and then decides how that's to be operated. I think it's going to be very difficult for an assessor to say that's what it's going to be. So, as I say, I don't know the detail of what's coming through, but maybe Andy would know better than me how that can be dealt with. But I do see it as problematic.
Yeah, it is hugely complicated, and it exists right now. You know, our assessors are having to deal with this. I must admit, it's not the area that I'm closest to. I'm more sort of focused on the domestic side, but I do accept that there is this change of tenancy, take the building back to its original fit out or as close to, make sure it meets the building regulations and also is a minimum standard in England and Wales that they need to adhere to, and then we go again. And it's when does the assessor go in and update the EPC if it's required at that point. So there is that complication, that nuance to consider. And again, as regulations change and come in, we have to sort of move and pivot around that and provide the best support and guidance to our members. In terms of the ratings, there isn't much change in there really. We've still got the HG rating based around carbon per metre squared, and then you've got the direct emissions, which is just the actual value of the A to G rating, and then you've got energy demand, which, you know, I think is eminently sensible. It sort of boils it down to sort of the brass tacks of how much energy is required per metre squared per year for that property. But it's regulated energy, and as we've already sort of established, it's very much down to the tenancy and the occupancy of that building as to whether that is close to the truth or whether they are completely off on a tangent doing something different with that building. Again, it's very much down to the assessor to capture that information, but if they're not in the property at the time, then we might have a divergence in the data that's ending up within the Scottish Register.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Oh, David?
Just on, so there's a potential unintended consequence with non-domestic buildings. So with the non-domestic buildings, we have essentially two paths of assessment. One is a simple model, the SBEM model, and one's a more detailed dynamic simulation. So it's split in various ways, which we don't need to talk about, but it's quite possible that with the home energy model coming in for residential buildings, that we might actually have, let's say, more building physics going on in the model of a house than we have going on in some of the simpler non-domestic buildings. And that's not by design, that's just by the fact that the home energy model is coming in to update residential assessments. So it might be further down the line, we actually need to think about, well, what would be the equivalent of the home energy model for simple non-domestic buildings? And that might then give us more opportunity to pull in more metrics and more useful information in the same way that we're talking about for residential buildings. For more complex non-domestic buildings, we already use a more involved modelling approach. But for simple non-domestic buildings, the SBEM model is also quite simple. It's more similar to SAP than it is to the home energy model. So that's a potential clash that we might have to fix.
Okay. Thanks. Just before I bring in Alexander Stewart with some questions, I just wanted to pick up, so on the incentive part, some of you talked about an incentive could be lowering energy bills, but we are now hearing potential work being done from the UK government, and I just also wonder, like, what happens if we finally get what some people are calling for, which is delinking electricity from the international gas price, right? So then electricity suddenly does become more affordable, and we lose an incentive there potentially. Are there still other incentives that could keep people going on that track? David?
I mean, I think if that happens, then we end up incentivising heat pumps more. So that's potentially a positive outcome, because one of the issues with heat pumps at the moment is that the energy bills could still be significant, even though your carbon emissions go down. Because of the switch, particularly switching from gas boiler to electric heat pump, your bills you may not see that saving with your energy bills because of the way electricity is costed and the way we pay for electricity. So if we do reform electricity pricing in the way you just suggested, actually that could be an additional incentive for some measures, and that transition from gas heating to non-gas and non-polluting heating.
Okay, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. I might have pressed R more than once. I absolutely agree, David. The transition to clean heat is very much around electric. It's not the only fuel in town, but it is. That's the general direction of travel. It's very difficult to do that when gas is historically and is still currently cheaper compared to electricity. And the calculation is relatively simple. It's electricity is about 3.5-4 times more expensive than gas, and therefore your heat pump or heating system needs to be 3 or 4 times more efficient in order to sort of balance the equation. And that is why we don't see recommendations, particularly a large number of recommendations for heat pumps on EPCs, because fundamentally an EPC is about fuel poverty and helping people understand running costs rather than, you know, the decarbonisation of heat. So come back to our original point around EPCs and the direction of travel there and fit for purpose. I think it's an essential piece of work that needs to happen, but we cannot also put anybody who's currently using gas into a position where they are moving towards fuel poverty or being plunged into fuel poverty, because we've tilted the what's its name, you know, the equation in the wrong direction, and that will happen if we get it wrong. So we have to be really laser focused on that as well.
Okay, good, great, thanks very much, Alexander.
Thank you, Kenny. We touched on this morning about the quality of assessment and training and aspects of that, but it would maybe be good to try and expand it about, really, do we have the availability of the assessors to undertake? Because the success of all of this will depend on making sure that everything is across the board. And you've already once again touched on urban and rural as to what implementation and the timings and the structure might take place. So it would be a good idea, and maybe Andy or Alan is the ones maybe to ask this initially, about how we can ensure that we have enough people available to do the assessments, because if that is not the case, then we will end up with a logjam in some process and people not getting what they expected in the timescales given.
Maybe that's one to start with, Andy.
Yeah.
We have a good level of coverage across Scotland for energy assessors. There are obvious areas where things are more difficult, islands, anything more rural, difficult to access. The travel time is often the sort of the rate limiting step, and then there is cost associated with that as well. We cannot lose sight, though, that EPCs are meant, their purpose is to be a starting point. The assessment is getting more and more complicated as we move forward. Complexity brings the potential for accuracy, but it also brings the potential for inaccuracy, because you need to maintain repeatability. So if we're going to make the assessment methodology more complicated, we're going to add time to site as well, which is going to add time, which is going to add cost, but also mean that less can be done in a day, which means that field force either needs to be bigger or we're going to just do less in the same time frame. About 2,000 energy assessors, and I say about because there is no hard and fast number, it changes on a daily basis. You'd expect them to be based around the major urban conurbations, which they are. I think there is enough resource there. Training is the other sort of the piece of the equation. If we need more assessors, then how long does it take to train from scratch? We are quite lucky in Scotland that the majority of the EPCs are being done by chartered surveyors. There is a pool of chartered surveyors there, and then we can supplement that with DEAs that are coming in from other walks of life. And there are ways of doing that training depending on their experience, their prior knowledge and experience. I will also say this, we haven't talked about validity period yet. I think it might be next on the list. If you are going to decrease the validity period, which you are, from 5 to 10 years, I think that's very, very sensible. Many reasons we can come to, but obviously that's going to add probably 20 to 30% on top of the current workload. So we have to be mindful of that. And I think it will cause some logjam in some parts of the country. We need to understand that, and we need to be able to address that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Alan?
I agree with Andy's comments on the logjam. That's one of our members' concerns, is that if this new system is brought in and then the clock starts ticking, that especially if you're talking about 28 for rental properties, I don't see how you're going to be able to train people and implement it, because every property is going to have to be reassessed. It's not just a very small number, it's vast. So I do worry that time frame is just far too tight, that we need to allow it to roll out properly. I'm not sure I agree with Andy on the 10-year, 5-year rule, because especially if this can become dynamic, there's almost no reason it needs to be outdated because it will automatically update itself. I think the 5-year is difficult because not much will change in 5 years unless you do a very specific fitment, which should show on the dynamic one. And it's a cost and a time and allocating resources that's probably unnecessary, particularly if it's dynamic.
Yeah. And if you think about the views from the Scottish Government themselves, the plans from what they've said about updating and auditing and assurances required, do you think there's enough of that being given from and by the Scottish Government within this timescale and the framework you're looking at?
I don't think there is enough time being allocated. I personally don't think that EPC that applying them should happen until, say, 2030, because I think landlords will need time to be given to do the reassessment, see what that means, go and look at costs, go and look at ways of implementing it. And also you've got the complication, you've got a tenant on board that you need to somehow get in there and do it. And okay, when a new tenant comes along, you have that window, but you've also got a window to lose lots of rental if you start doing an awful lot of work. So I think it's complicated, but I do think that Andy's team have got a big problem of getting that all assessed and then telling people where they are and then giving people time to actually do something about it. It needs to be programmed in, and you know these budgets are not small by any stretch of the
imagination. Andy, do you agree with that? Do you see that as a complication that the Scottish Government are not? Does that give you some security, or does it not give you security on that process?
I do understand and recognise the concerns there. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to have a window of time where all landlords have to improve buildings, invariably it's either locked to the void period, or it's going to have to be planned in some way. Now, if everybody plans it in at the same sort of time frame, which, let's be honest, will probably be towards the back end of it, then we're going to have a potential issue there. So I think this is about education, this is about awareness and a desire to avoid that scenario. I don't think you can give it sort of like to open it up further, because then all we do is shift the timescales back. But yeah, I think the assessment of buildings, if we have to assess buildings in a short period of time to make sure everybody's in the same place, that will be problematic. I'm not really sure if that's necessarily what will end up happening. But I mean, we will talk about validity period. I will agree to disagree with Alan on that one. I think moving from 10 years to certainly reducing the validity period is necessary, even if we have a dynamic aspect to EPCs, because I think if you're going to make decisions on of significance on a building, you need up-to-date information. And even if you have got information of I've just done this or I've just done that, you'll be surprised at how much buildings do change in a relatively short period of time.
Okay. Anything from David or Gillian? David?
Go on, David, and then Gillian wants to come in as well.
I think we have to push for a challenging timescale because our buildings are already behind the curve. So you know, we have to kind of get on with it to some extent. Though I appreciate the practical issues of that. In terms of the kind of volume of EPC assessments coming through, yes, that's going to be a challenge, as sort of Andy's mentioned. But we've decided in Scotland and the rest of the UK to have an approach where we have very quite simple assessments and relatively low, in fact, a zero education requirement of our assessors, but quite a well-structured training regime for those assessors, quite a formal training regime that other countries don't have. Some other countries have a higher threshold of education background for their assessors. We don't have that. We have a simple assessment, simple training approach. The home energy model coming in doesn't necessarily have to disrupt that, because we have this idea of wrappers around the model. So it's a bit like someone changing my car engine, but I can still drive the car, so I don't really care what's happened to the engine. I can still get on with it and drive the car. So the home energy model may come across in that way. I think we will have to retrain assessors. They will need to have additional information, particularly if new output metrics have been generated by the home energy model. But I think it is manageable if we do it in the right way.
Okay. Gillian?
Thanks.
Thanks. Just to start, I'd like to agree with what David's just said about we need to get on with this. In terms of EPC reform, I think it was mentioned at the start, we've been talking about this for coming on to a decade now, I think. And in terms of minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector, for example, the sector has had a clear understanding that this was coming down the line for at least 5 or 6 years. So, it's been a long time coming. People are expecting this. In terms of going forward and the challenges of getting this delivered in time, as I understand it, the Scottish Government's proposing to roll out the new system from late 2026, following UK Government completion on the HEMWork. That still gives us 2 years before the 2028 date for the private rented sector for change of tenancy work. So that it's doable. Granted, it will need a concerted effort and to be well coordinated if we're going to make it happen. But it is doable. I also wanted to make a point around the training side and the sort of capacity building to aid rollout of the new EPC system, and point out that training isn't necessarily just about the assessors' side of things. This is all about the consumers at the end of the day, the homeowners, the tenants, the landlords, and how they use the information. So they need to understand it. So I think as part of the training programme over the next couple of years, we need to make sure that communicating the content of the EPC is a key part of that training. We need to support assessors to be able to communicate the findings, but also solicitors and estate agents, for example, so they're able to engage with their clients and explain what it means and what their options are more effectively. To make sure, as I said earlier, that it's not just a bit of paper or a website or whatever that gives you information, because the whole point of this is about driving action. So people need to understand what it is they're being told and what they can do about it.
And my final question is about enforcement. Because if we're having all this take place, enforcement falls on the councils to look at and to try and manage that, and that there'll be practical issues when it comes to that, and there might also be the penalties that may well be placed upon who have not fulfilled themselves in the time. And it would be good to get a view on that, because if we are going to struggle to get everything done in some areas, then the onus lies on a council to then deal with enforcement. And how that is managed and how they cope with that may well become an issue for us down the line as well. Who would like to kick off? Andy? Alan?
I think it's obviously going to be difficult for the council to suddenly deal with this, but I think that's the right route to go. That's really going to have to be down to the council how they manage that. I think the penalties concerns me slightly, because there was a figure bandied about of a £30,000 fine, which, I think people maybe need to know that there's a carrot rather than a stick. And if the stick's like a tree, then what's going to happen is people are going to look at that and go, well, my property's worth 100,000 and there's a £30,000 fine. I think I'll just sell it. And that's the worst thing that could happen, because that's just going to have a massive impact on availability. So I think the council may have a resource problem, but the stick is a bit too large, or disproportionate.
Okay. Andy wanted to come in.
Yeah, I absolutely recognise that. I will say this though: there hasn't really been a stick previously. Notionally, yes, a lot of enforcement has been done passively through other processes. To make sure EPCs are in place at the point of sale or rental. We still see huge amounts of non-compliance with the regulation, though. So enforcement is essential, especially as we're going to expand the remit and new regulations are coming in around minimum standards, etc. I will say this: training is essential. Awareness and Elmhurst and other schemes are obviously there to help and support councils meet that training need if that's where they want to go. I think the key thing to all of this is data and the availability of data and bringing together databases. Obviously, the world of AI is a wonderful place and is moving forward at pace. But I think where before it was seen as a very difficult thing to do, to bring large data sets together and do something sensible with them, I think these are infinite opportunities now to to take an awful lot of the heavy lifting out of that process. And I completely agree with the comments of Alan, which is this isn't about penalties. This is about education. This is about nudges and making sure that those that need to do something are doing it. That doesn't necessarily mean slapping a big penalty on somebody or have the threat of the penalty. There should be ample room to realise that something hasn't been done and then can be done. Without that need for the penalty. And I think generally, while Trade Association Pepper has been helping in that, just raising awareness, writing letters to where there is non-conformities and non-compliance, and almost 100% of the time, the right thing is done. And all it took was a letter.
Yeah.
Can I just come in with a supplementary there? Andy, you talked about data sets and bringing together large data sets. So can you just unpack that a little bit so we understand what kinds of things you're thinking about there?
Okay. Well, but obviously the EPC data set you could call it an open data set, but you've got data on every property that has an EPC. So therefore, you know there's an EPC, you know the rating, you know the validity period, etc., etc. There will be other data sets on property transactions. There will be data sets on council tax or equivalent. There will be things like that where you can start to build a picture of which property has an EPC, when did they have it in time for a transaction, have they had an EPC in place since it transacted that's at the right level, and then it's just a case of, well, what does the use of that data mean? What's the next step? How do you rectify a problem where one exists? I'm afraid I can't go into much more detail than that because that other part isn't my world, but we are starting to see it more and more. We've seen some enforcement activity happening in places like Westminster, for example, where they are doing that with the data, and it is having an impact. We're seeing the levels of compliance increasing up to almost, sort of the high 90s, which is fantastic.
Great, thanks. Back to you, Alexander.
I think that is probably enough for me, convener. I think
okay.
If anyone else has got anything, but no, I think that's content.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning, panel. I think the danger of going last in these things, usually a lot of your topics that you want to discuss have already been discussed, but I haven't heard from David and Gillian specifically on the EPC validity time period being reduced from 10 years to 5 years. So it would be helpful just to hear your views on that, what your opinion is on the reduction of the time frame there. And David, if I could start with you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I generally support it. Again, I'm aware of the implications that will have on certain stakeholders. I think when you see that written down, it does feel like, well, we need to double up on EPCs. But actually, as has already been intimated, we can be more efficient with the way we generate these EPCs. EPCs, if we're following the European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, EPCs don't actually need a site visit. Very often there's a pretty good reason why they do need a site visit. But I suppose back to if we're storing data properly with high levels of kind of quality control, we can kind of crack open that old EPC again, potentially, and revisit it with new assumptions. And maybe that's how we revise our EPCs every 5 years. And there may be some situations where somebody does need to actually go back in and do that EPC again. There'll be a cost attached to that for potentially the owner of that building, and that's, we have to understand that. But yeah, for the reasons that have already been mentioned, I think we need to. 10 years is too long a period for EPCs. Too much changes over that time period. But we can be a bit smarter with how we refresh EPCs. It doesn't necessarily require a human being always going to that building. We've already described how EPCs are very, very simple. Because they're so simple, actually, if we store data better, we can generate those EPCs in a much more efficient way, and then a 5-year cycle becomes a lot more manageable.
Gillian wanted to come in, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to add to that point that it doesn't mean we're going to be doing twice as many. There are different ways of delivering this. Now, the existing Home Alliance doesn't have a particular position on the reducing of the timescales, but I do know that some of our members would be keen that consideration is given to resource implications for social landlords, for example. So while there is a desire to provide prospective owners and tenants with most up-to-date information, and that's positive, there will be resource implications in some cases that we need to be mindful of, particularly if landlords, for example, are required to get a new EPC after energy efficiency upgrades, as well as if temporary change of tenancy. But I do also appreciate that there are different ways of doing this, and it doesn't necessarily mean a full site visit for every certificate.
Okay,
Thank
and
you.
Megan, Andy also wants to come back in on that.
Okay.
Yeah, just to agree with everybody, really. We already see the precedent set by something like DEC, Display Energy Certificate. That's typically a 7 or 10 year cycle. One site visit and then repeated updates of the report or the certificate after that. And that's using data and evidence that's been gathered by the building owner and given back to the energy assessor. So it is very, very possible. I do agree 100% with David on if we start a process. Let's say we take a brand new building. We've got all the evidence there. It's all documented. Obviously, we need to make sure that that's what's installed in the building. But things like the U value, the psi value, the original specs, the plan, the floor plan of the building, all should be stored within logbook or similar, and then accessible by the energy assessor, who's going to update that report. And I think we probably need to explore some time limits as well, because things do change. But it can be done, and we do also have the technology now to visit a site without visiting a site. So I think all things are possible.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. And it was a point that Gillian raised in relation to landlords that I would like to expand upon just a little bit, if you can bear with me, because we will be hearing from the Scottish Association of Landlords in our next panel, and they've stated that they do have concerns regarding this particular proposal, because it will increase costs for landlords without delivering significant additional value. They've stated that the energy efficiency of most properties will not materially change within 5 years, and they're considering, or they're asking perhaps, for a more proportionate approach, which would be require a new EPC at the first letting following the minimum energy efficiency standard compliance data, and then retain the 10-year validity period thereafter. I'm wondering if anyone's got any thoughts on any of those concerns, or indeed alternative proposal.
Anybody? I mean, just to say, if they are correct about the frequency of change of buildings, then that's probably a sign that we failed on retrofit anyway. So it's almost a moot point is whether EPCs have been effective, because if we're not upgrading the building stock on the time scale between 5 and 10 years, then we're not going to be hitting our retrofit targets and carbon targets anyway. So what we actually need, they're probably right in terms of historical action. Not a lot changes in those time periods, but we're trying to enter a phase of changing how we do retrofit and refurbishment, where we want changes to be occurring over those timescales.
Thanks. Just similar to what David was saying there, actually, the whole point of this is about driving improvement across our housing stock. So we would hope that there would be some improvement over the next 5 to 10 years to ensure that we're tackling the big challenges around fuel poverty, around damp and mould. And whilst the vast majority of homes in the private rented sector and others are in very good condition, I do feel that actually, even if things weren't changing that much, does that not go back to the earlier point that then an in-person EPC assessment maybe isn't required, and there are sort of fairly high-level, streamlined ways of doing this? I think it's about how we implement the proposals, and how we, from the outset, are thinking, well, how do we do this as efficiently and effectively as possible, without placing any sort of unnecessary burden on the homeowner, whether it's a landlord or an owner-occupier, and also how are we making sure that the people who get the certificate in the end are getting something that they can do something with, that they know what to do with and is usable.
Okay, and briefly, Andy, it's popular.
Yes, I agree. And maybe there is something there in terms of if you're having a retrofit program in place, you have a pre and a post EPC, and the post EPC can just be done off the pre plus the work that's been done through as 2030 or similar. I think that's very valid. And maybe once you're at a certain standard, maybe the frequency of EPC could be reduced. But yeah, that's probably one idea.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Alan.
Yes, I'm just going to follow up on that. I think that's exactly the point, is that I think if something has changed, that's a good idea to get the EPC updated, whether that can be done dynamically or has to be another assessment. But I don't think if anything, nothing's been done, I don't see any point just doing an EPC for the sake of it. It should only be done when something has changed.
I think that goes back to the argument, you know, it's upfront costs versus potential benefits that could follow thereafter. But again, it's that upfront cost that will be daunting to many homeowners right up and down the country with these reforms coming through.
And it could be a cost that's not really achieving anything.
Yes. If I could stick on this theme just for a second, because again, going back to the geographical challenges that we discussed earlier on in terms of rural versus more urban properties, again, you know, when you look at Scottish Land and Estates, they are hinting at some concerns in relation to implementation as well, because rural properties are harder to retrofit, to upgrade, to achieve EPC ratings. And in fact, when you look at rural properties right now, given the type of buildings they are, the structures, the age of them, usually they are higher costs associated with trying to get them up to a good energy efficiency standard. So how do we get round that? Because again, you know, you've got houses and rural properties right now that don't achieve EPC, which is the energy efficiency standard that you're hoping for. So with these new reforms, how's that going to be achieved without asking for ridiculous energy efficiency measures, such as for a rural property that stand alone, they've got to put up a wind turbine in the front of it. That's just one example that I've heard of directly from a homeowner in relation to trying to make their homes more energy efficient, but actually facing significant barriers in the way.
Gillian wants to come in on that.
Thanks. Yes, just briefly, in terms of the disparity between rural and urban, I think what we have to remember is the focus on the occupant of the house. So how comfortable is it for them, irrespective of where they live? So the system should be giving them information about how much energy they need to heat their home, irrespective of where it is, how much it's going to cost them, irrespective of where it is. And then we need to think about, well, how do we make sure that there's fairness across the country and people in rural areas aren't having to pay more because of where they happen to live? And that's where we need to make sure that we've got the right framework of support, so that people living in rural areas, if they need additional measures to make sure that they can afford to heat their home properly and live comfortably with clean air quality, that they're not adversely affected by this. So that means making sure that the right grant framework and financing mechanisms framework is in place, so that additional measures are supported. So, for example, additional insulation measures or battery storage and solar panels. You know, different measures should be available to bring down the cost and reduce the impact on areas where the implications could be negative.
Okay, and Andy.
Yeah, I think as much as anything, this isn't about saying you must have a wind turbine stood outside your front door. It is about saying what's reasonable and where does the line fall. You know, the regulations say EPC. I mean, we need to understand what that means under the new metrics. And if we're talking about improving the thermal performance, so the heat retention of the building, well, that's different to putting a wind turbine outside your house. So I think that needs to be sort of taken into consideration. I'm completely with Gillian. We can't allow properties that, because they're rural, just to fall behind, because it will just create a big chasm, and it becomes even more expensive and even more difficult to bridge that gap in later years. So we have to start making progress with all buildings, irrespective whether they are rural or urban or otherwise. But I do accept it is a bigger challenge. People like the National Trust have spent a lot of time talking to, and it's interesting to see how they're addressing that challenge, because they've got a very large rural portfolio, and you know, they've managed to achieve some really good stuff at relatively cost-effective levels of investment, and I think we should be looking at what they're trying to achieve. I think it's very, very interesting how they're addressing the challenge.
David.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be quite happy to see micro wind turbines removed from the EPC recommendation list. That's not where wind turbines should be built, but that's as an aside. Yeah. It's important to remember there will be an exemption list for these policies, as there always is. And if we look what happened with the clean heat policy and ending polluting heating systems, rural areas were a particular part of that exemption list. We have to obviously then be careful that the exemption list isn't so long that we're missing out lots of properties. Yeah. But of course, some of these rural properties, they have particular need for action as well, because their heating is so expensive. So we don't want to move people onto an exemption list and then they don't get the action that they need to reduce their energy bills. So it's, yeah, there is a wider conversation to be had.
I think the problems are not restricted to rural. You have the same urban problems with tenement properties and so on, and this is where the exemption list is going to come in. And we do have issues about the number of people that's going to impact on. You don't want this to turn into a wee narrow window of people who are contributing to it and achieving very little. It needs to be a wider solution, but costs are the one thing that's probably going to drive this, and it's a big concern that some of these properties are very, very difficult to achieve an upgrade, and they are very costly to achieve. And things like flats are very difficult when it's one flat and you've got all these other people round about who don't want to know and are not necessarily involved at this stage because it's maybe only rental properties.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for an owner to do something that doesn't impact on surrounding properties. So it's not just a rural problem, it's actually a global problem of how do you assess every individual building and make sure that it's a fair and reasonable assessment for each.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much, everyone, for answering those questions. We have discussed consumer awareness and confidence in the new system, so I'll not go into those questions that I had because we don't have much time left. Regarding the proposed timetable, again, we've talked about the implementation date for later in 2026. So it's just in case anyone has any further comments they want to make in relation to the assessor market and for those in the property letting and conveyancing sectors to prepare, because I think this is going to be hugely important. Alan, you touched upon this earlier on, just in case anyone has any further comments in that space, because this will be crucial to the implementation of the new EPC reforms.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, the concern is that there's an assessment time. Well, there's getting the rules ready and getting them fit for purpose. Then there's an assessment period. And then there's taking that information. Now, I know Gillian said that the rental sector has been aware of this. Well, we have been aware of it, but we've not been aware of what the detail is going to be. And we're not going to know until next year what that detail actually is. And then you need time to assess it and make a programme, budget to do it. So my concern is if, for example, the rules don't come out till later in 26, then there's an assessment period. You need a period for that, and then you need a period to get your EPC done and then assess it yourself and then budget it. I do feel that the 28 is a bit tight, that it should probably be maybe 2 to 3 years after it's introduced, whenever that may be, because it might not be 26, it might slip, I don't know. So I think the concern is it's all just a bit too tight to make sensible and reasonable decisions.
Gillian.
Thanks. To build on some of what Alan's saying there, any changes to the EPC system will have implications. For example, the current energy efficiency ratings, the basis for measuring social landlords' compliance with the energy efficiency standard for social housing, EISH. And I know that bodies like the SFHA and many landlords are hugely supportive of reform and the introduction of a fabric efficiency rating. It's essential that the EPC reforms are appropriately aligned with the new social housing net zero standard, and recognition given to any potential impact the changeover might have on social landlords. And I suppose just to finish off, councils and housing associations really do urgently need confirmation of what that new social housing net zero standard is going to look like, along with the technical guidance that's required and a clear transition plan detailing how they can shift to the new EPC system and new reporting systems.
That's helpful, thank you. And then finally, although this is not directly part of EPC, it does form part of the wider discussion, because we do have, or we should have at some point, a heating buildings bill that's going to come through the Scottish Parliament. We don't have much time left, of course, between now and the end of this parliamentary term, but there should be a discussion, as the Government have outlined, on this particular issue. So I'm looking to hear your views and how these particular regulations fit in with the whole heating buildings bill, from what you know or what you're aware of, and in relation to legislation in general. We've had the housing bill, which we're sitting and hearing later on today. Then we'll have heating buildings bill, and of course we've got EPC reform. Do you think we're over legislating, trying to do too much at the one time? And I don't know who wants to pick that up, because I know that's a huge question as well.
Okay. There is a risk that there's too much. All regulatory stuff ends up costing money to achieve, as well as time and resource. But you know, we have to move forward. So it's all about timing and making things happen in a reasonable format. I think the EPC is crucial that we do move that forward. Building regs, as far as the boilers and upgrading insulation, I think new builds are well covered, and I don't think there's really a need to start pushing that much further forward. I think they're all very good. More of an issue is just how we deal with the existing stock and slowly bring that forward. If I could touch on the cost side of it, of all these things, I'm worried, and our members are very worried, that all these costs are just building up, and from a landlord perspective, they're starting to become unviable. Because, for example, if you have a property that's, say, you know, the difference between a property at 100k and a property at 800k, you know, if there's talk of a £10,000 spend, well, £10,000 spend on an 800k property is not that bad, but it is on a 100k property. If you spend 10k on upgrading insulation and any kind of carbon reduction, you probably would only be able to charge maybe £100 a month rent extra, if at all.
Yeah. That's
going to take you 8 to 10 years to cover. In parallel with that, you have these other regulations kicking in. You have mortgages going up by, say, £200 to £300 a month. You've got kitchens, bathrooms, regular maintenance that you have to do. There's a risk that all these things collectively start to make them unviable, because it's not. This public perception is that landlords are making a huge amount of money on every property, but it's not the case. It's actually quite a small margin, and if you chip away all of that at once, it becomes difficult to swallow. And I think what will happen is people will look at it and say, this is unviable, I'll just put my money in the bank. Yeah. And then you've got the big problem of reduction in properties available. So I am concerned that all these things are just building up and building up. I'm not saying they shouldn't happen, I'm just saying that maybe they need to happen over a better spread. And I know that conflicts with the target of trying to achieve all these things as soon as possible. But just being realistic, I see that as a problem.
That's really helpful, thank you. Yes.
Okay, so, sorry, Andy indicated first. Andy and then David.
I think Gillian had a hand up first. I'm quite
keen to
hear from Gillian first.
That? Yeah. Okay. So let's go Gillian, Andy, then David.
Thank you, Andy. Just firstly on the costs point that was just touched on, that £10,000 cap, it is a cap. It's not an expectation that that's what people will spend. Research we've been carrying out recently has clearly indicated that the average is going to be about £3,500 for the vast majority of homes, a lot less than that for some and a bit more than that for others. So I don't feel we should be overly focused on that 10,000 cap and assume that that's going to be the norm. You know, in some cases it will be. The point on the regulation, no, I really don't think we're over-regulating in the slightest. I think one of the things that we know from talking to industry is that industry needs policy certainty to be able to invest in creating the skills and jobs that we're going to need over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And they don't have that policy certainty just now. So if we can use the regulations, the Heat and Buildings Bill and the PRS Minimum Energy Efficiency Regs to set out a clear pathway to net zero and give industry a clear idea of what their pipeline is going to look like over the next 10, 15 years. That then frees them up to borrow, to invest in creating jobs right across the country, and actually help us to make sure that we've got the supply chain in place so homeowners can act on their EPC certificates.
Thank you.
And Andy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things in there. I think we need the ambition. We need the scope of it all, because we need to be able to understand how this all sits together. So if we were to start to curtail some of that ambition, well, it's going to come at some point. It's just we don't have the clarity, and I think that's absolutely key. We need sort of certainty and some clarity so that we can start to roll this out. I think what Alan was saying is right on in terms of the timeline and the phasing of how the legislation comes into being. I think that's the way it will be effective. It's not necessarily saying there's too much at the start. It's just how it's phased. We also haven't really spoken about the concepts around value and devaluation of property as a result of EPC ratings, and I think that's a consideration. If you draw a line in the sand, and we've seen this within sort of mortgage valuation stuff and things like green mortgages, you start to put a value on the energy performance rating, then it starts to move the needle around a little bit, and it becomes another sort of consideration within the equation. Clearly, we are seeing better ratings having an impact on the value of a property, and I would expect that you move this forward, put higher minimum standards in, have slightly different metrics as well, and we'll see that value needle move around. The worst case scenario is someone doesn't do something, there's a devaluation of the property over time, becomes harder to sell, becomes less desirable, impacts on the value further, and of course it doesn't access that cheaper lending models that are now coming out and coming to the fore. So I think there's sort of like a double or triple whammy going on there that we need to be mindful of.
Thank you.
And David.
Yeah, if we've ended up having slightly parallel exercises around EPC and energy efficiency and clean heat, it's probably because we've been missing targets on energy efficiency, and so we've had to kind of crack on with the clean heat drive to reduce to decarbonise heat in buildings. But if we get the EPCs right, then they should be recommending the same technologies that the clean heat bill is trying to push anyway. So they're not against each other. They should align quite well. I mean, having been on some of the heating buildings discussions with the Scottish Government, I think there probably could have been a little bit more dialogue between the EPC reform group and those looking at clean heat and the different definitions and targets being used. There's reasons why that's challenging, but I think we can bring these things together. I don't think it needs to come across as we have to do this, but now you also have to satisfy a new set of targets. They should align to the same targets, really.
That's helpful. Thank you very much, all. Thank you, convener.
Thanks. Okay, well, that concludes our questions. So thanks so much for contributing to the discussion. I think it's been very helpful to hear your views. I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. I now welcome our second panel of witnesses this morning, and we're joined by John Blackwood, who's the Chief Executive at the Scottish Association of Landlords, and Brian Leask, who's the Secretary at the Rural and Island Housing Association Forum. And we've got around 60 minutes for this discussion. And as I mentioned to the previous panel, there's no need for you to operate your own microphones, and members may direct questions to specific witnesses. However, if you'd like to come in, please indicate to the clerks. And I am now going to start with an initial kind of opening question, which is, be interested to hear your views. And Brian, I'll direct this one to you first, but I'm going to seek views from both of you on the need to reform the EPC system. So we know that we've been at this for quite a while. 2017, we started to work on that. So the views on that reform and your overall views on the Scottish Government's broad approach.
There's definitely a need for reform. We've been calling for that for a long time. I think trying to bear in mind what an EPC actually is and what it does. When it was first came into kind of force, it was a piece of information at a point in time. That was its purpose. And we're trying to now see EPCs as a bit of a silver bullet to solve all our ills. That's not what it is. It's not what it does. I was a domestic energy assessor back in my previous life. So carrying out those assessments was part of what you used to do. The problem we've got with them, because they are standardised, is they're not particularly accurate. They don't give particularly accurate information to the homeowner, the tenant, whoever it might be. It also is restricted to regulated energy. So as a tenant, how do you split out that regulated energy from your energy bill? You don't. You have an overall bill that you pay. And if you get told on an EPC that your regulated energy costs X, but you know you're paying Y, then you have a doubt within the accuracy of that EPC. That's not what the EPC is trying to tell you. So we do absolutely need that reform. We need to have a look again at what the EPC is actually for, what we're trying to use it for, and the information that it provides. So it's not before time that I think we're looking at what we've got.
And in terms of the Scottish Government's approach?
It's getting there. I think there's things I might want to kind of strengthen a bit, and there's some areas in that I think are actually going in the right direction. So looking at the matrix that we're going to go and put onto the proposed EPC, it's absolutely the right direction. The move to the heat retention rating is absolutely the right thing to do. It tells the story about how well the building itself will retain the heat that's created, and that, in all honesty, is about the only thing that should be important, because we can't dictate what the cost of the tariff from a supply company would be. We can only dictate in terms of control of how much energy that house can actually use or needs to use. So that heat energy or the fabric efficiency rating, however you want to call it, is probably the key metric on that, and I think it's the best change, I think, going forward.
Okay, great. John, what are your thoughts on the need for reform and the overall views on your overall views on the Scottish Government's approach?
I very much agree with what Brian was saying, so rather than reiterate that, I think just to add to it in the sense that we need to get back to focus on, what matters to landlords and to tenants with regards to the EPC, what they're trying to find out. When we're letting properties, our prospective tenants are looking at that property and they're saying, how much is this going to cost me to live in this property? So they're thinking, of course, about the rental costs, which is the primary concern that they have, but they're also thinking about the running costs, quite rightly so. So they're asking, what are the bills in this property, and how warm is this property going to be for me to live in it and call my home? Now, the EPC does not answer those questions. So it's easy for me as a landlord to turn around to the tenant and say, well, there's the EPC and you can see what it is, but it doesn't really address the burning questions that people are asking. And likewise with the landlords, they're looking at the EPC and say, what can I learn from this? What is this telling me about my property? And again, that's very unclear. So as you'll see from our submission, we very much welcome the proposals to look at the EPC and, of course, as to how that fits into the bigger decarbonisation agenda.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'm going to move on to EPC ratings and assessment methodology. And And I'll go to you again, Brian, first, because you just start to talk about heat retention ratings and things like that. So I'd be interested to hear your views on the three sets of ratings that the Scottish Government intends to display on the EPC. So that heat retention rating, the heating system rating, and the energy cost rating. And also I'd be interested on your views on the assessment methodology.
Yeah, I mean, the heat retention rate, and I've kind of touched on already, and I think that is it's a good change. It's one that's been long needed, to be honest. Also ties back to some of the proposals we're seeing from government coming forward with the net zero standard for social housing that's coming through. So tying those together, making sure we're not asking for more than one thing, I think is key. And the idea of it being location neutral, I think, is key. So we are comparing like for like on that sort of basis. When we come on to the heating system type, that's it's in the right direction, understanding what that's going to be, but by not being location specific. So areas where I'm from in Shetland, we're a net exporter of renewable energy. We're producing 13 times more energy on Shetland from renewables than what we need as an island to operate. But that's not taken into account. So we're taking that kind of national average position in terms of what that would be and using the SAP definition on that in terms of that centralised house somewhere doesn't then allow that decarbonise or that measure of locational sensitivity that maybe would be better. And the idea of it being just about decarbonisation, I think that's really what it's kind of aiming at. Well, most houses, particularly in that kind of rural aspect, are going to be on electric fed. And if we take the electric grid system as it goes, it's becoming more decarbonised all the time. So the position in that house will change. So the heating element will change. But we need to be careful on that one, because I think the recommendation when we've kind of looked at the software on that, and it comes back to the methodology, is the recommendation tends to be for a heat pump. And I can understand that the efficiency, the coefficient on that is better than it would be for a storage heating system. But as our grid gets smarter, we're going to have a need in homes to store energy when it's cheap. That's just a reality. Heat pumps don't do that. They're not a storage capacity. Storage heaters do. Storage heaters have the capacity to store energy when it's cheap. And if you can tie that back into a smart meter in that property, you then allow the tenant the opportunity to store that energy when it is cheap or free, depending on how far we go with the energy market. On the energy cost rating is an area where we do have some concern. Cost ratings are never accurate. As soon as you do one, it's out of date because the fluctuations in energy costs just fluctuate so much. And the other thing is, like I said before, the EPC only covers regulated energy, only covers, and what proposal is here is just for the heating element. But a tenant doesn't see that breakdown. They get a bill from the energy supplier, that's what they pay, that's what they know the cost is. So having an EPC that tells them that the cost element is an A because you've got a really efficient, but then as a household, unless we educate them how they're going to become more efficient themselves, don't operate at that A level. So they're not operating in line with EPC as is being produced. But part of the concern we do have from a rural perspective is we do operate in areas where we have longer heating seasons, where we have higher wind speeds, where we have more detached properties than there in the urban areas. And when grant providers are providing grants on the condition of an EPC, particularly if they're looking at that cost parameter, the cost parameter is not accurate in that rural perspective because it's going to cost more. You're going to need more energy to heat that property than somebody in an urban area. And if we're using that to assess whether a grant is applicable to that property or not, then we need to be very, very careful. We did a piece of work within REHAF looking at what Ofgem's recommendations would be for the amount of energy required to heat a home, or actually just for running a home. And it's about 15,000 kilowatt hours per year. That's Ofgem's recommendation. And they say that the average household, and we've all seen that the energy cap is £1,750 per year. If you take that and move that to a rural element on a house with storage heaters, for that same £1,700, they'll only be able to buy 6,000 kilowatt hours of energy, within a year. So they're paying for the same sort of money Ofgem says an average household should be spending in a year, then a household in the rural areas is less than half the energy they can buy if they're on a fully electric system. And that's all to do with just the price of the tariff.
Right. Gas
operating that probably currently be 3.7 to 4 pence a kilowatt hour, and your cheapest element on energy for electric is going to be about 16 pence a kilowatt hour. It's 4 times more expensive. 10 years ago, it was twice. We've gone from energy for electric on homes being twice as expensive as gas to now being 4 times as expensive as in gas. And that's where the breakdown in this is going to come from, and that's what's driven a lot of people back into that fuel poverty. And we need to be careful we're not going to push more people into this with the recommendations on on the EPCs.
Okay, just before I bring in John on the ratings and assessment methodology, if you want to come in on that, I'm interested around your point that currently the recommendations are a lot around air source heat pumps. And I guess you could, with an air source heat pump system, you could have a storage system in terms of having a hot water tank that would heat, that you could then use to heat your heating system. But another thing that we've been hearing about is the potential for solar thermal. So you could have, you could bring up your heating to a certain level, and we could also help people in terms of the damp and mold. So you'd actually have a warmth in the house as well. I mean, I know that's getting off EPC, but I think it's kind of all connected. And as you both said, it's like people want to know what's actually happening in their experience of living in their home.
Well, I think to bear in mind, I mean, with the recommendation, I'll go back to the heat pump element. At the moment, you apply to put a heat pump in your property, you'll probably get a grant to install that. That heat pump will probably last you, and we have been installing them now in Shelton for 25 years. They'll last about 12 years, roughly. You don't get a grant to replace it. Now, you've got to find that capital investment yourself to replace that heat pump in 12 years' time. So we need to understand not just the capital expenditure at the outset, but the longevity of that component and actually the cost element of that component. And as I said, we've been doing this for 25 years in Shetland, and the research we've done shows that if you go, the cost difference over a 30-year life cycle maintenance programme that we have, if we have a storage heating system, that will be a quarter of the price over 30 years than a heat pump system. Because it will last 30 years. The component will last 30 years. And while it is more expensive than a heat pump for the tenant to run, it's actually, from our perspective as a landlord, much, much cheaper. It's a quarter of the price to have a storage heating system as opposed to a heat pump system. Now, it comes back to that cost element that, well, do we then need to increase our rent? Now, again, the research we've done is if we moved all our homes onto heat pumps, we would have to increase our rents by £500 per year per property. Now, that's probably going to be in excess of 13, 14, 15% of an increase on your rent if we moved from our current heating system to a solely heat pump system. So, like I said, we need to be careful in terms of the recommendation, and we need to have an understanding of what we're actually asking people to try and do. On individual homes, I can understand that's going to, if you make a choice, that's what you want to do, that's fine. But as landlords, we need to be careful.
Right, okay. So there's something about thinking about the bigger picture and the context, and I think maybe also, I asked the question earlier and you touched on it too, that if we get to a point where we're delinking electricity from international gas prices, then your storage system actually would, the cost of that would fall.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it already. I mean, there is tariffs coming out there where you get 7 hours cheap rate, but they all tend to be linked to having the electric cars. Now, why would an electric car be able to be charged at 7 pence a kilowatt hour, but can't charge my storage here at 7 pence a kilowatt? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So the people that can afford having an electric car, and they're not cheap, can get electricity, full electricity for all their home at 7 pence a kilowatt hour for 7 hours a day. But I have a storage heating system, I can't afford an electric car, and I can't. Why is that? So it's fundamentally, there's some questions in there in terms of the energy market that we need to be asking. And I don't think that's kind of going beyond the EPC position, but they're all interlinked. We need to be careful. They can't be looked at in isolation.
Yeah, great. Thanks for letting me go down that path a little bit. John, do you have any comments on the EPC ratings and the assessment methodology?
Yes, I guess to go back to actually the methodology, we certainly welcome that. I think it's much clearer for both landlords and tenants to be able to investigate and look at, and as I said earlier, answer the questions that they're really asking. I think a big aspect of the EPC that we tend to overlook is that it only shows part of the data that's collected by the assessor. And that's a problem for landlords, because often landlords will come to us complaining, saying, I have an EPC here and I don't think it's correct. It's not accurate. How can I interrogate the data? They're unable to do so. So I think certainly in the proposals about developing a system whereby that data can be interrogated for the sake of accuracy, if nothing else, would be very welcome. And we need to be thinking about what is the basis of the metric. How is that data used? How transparent are we in sharing that data so that anybody could see it? Obviously, in particular, the landlord as the owner of the property, but equally the home user, the person living in that home, the tenant. So I think that's important to think about how the data is shared. We can look at all the metrics we want, but it has to be clear, it has to be simple and easily understood by us all. So I think that's a challenge in itself there. And with regards to the data, another issue we have is that, as I say, we can have landlords saying, I can go to 2 EPC assessors and they'll give me a different EPC rating. So how do I know which one is right? Interrogation of that data would allow them to identify that. Maybe somebody's made a mistake or they've not picked up the correct information or whatever. So that could be looked at that time. The other thing is, as well, is if a new EPC assessment is done as a result of the tenant getting home improvements made through the different schemes that are available, the landlord might not be aware of that because they don't get that new EPC. So we do believe there needs to be a system implemented whereby if the EPC is upgraded or changed in some way, then the landlord should be notified of that so that they know what the true EPC rating of that property is. We have lots of cases and complaints from landlords saying, I didn't know a new EPC was registered in my property. Nobody told me that, and it's different to the one that I think is correct and the one that I'm using. So I think there's big issues more so about the data and the collation of that, the transparency of that, and how that, of course, transfers into the actual EPC itself.
Okay, so something there maybe we were talking in the previous panel about a dynamic interface online where maybe EPCs are linked to the property and everyone can see that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why we welcome, and I know it's moving on from the discussion of the EPCs, but in the regulations that are being discussed and should be laid before Parliament, of the introduction of the HEATSA, which would be a big step forward in us being able to look at that technical suitability assessment. The trouble is with the timing of it all, now I know your previous panel was talking about that for private landlords, that will not be available until 2028. That system. And of course we have to comply, perhaps certainly within the draft regulations that we've seen so far, we have to comply with the 1st of April 2028. So we won't have time to be able to see that system in order to comply. And we believe that we need to be looking at the dates, and that's something we're pursuing with the Cabinet Secretary at the moment.
Okay, great. I'm now going to bring in Evelyn Tweed with some questions.
Vina, good morning to the panel and thanks for your answers so far. It's been very helpful. I'm going to come to you first, John. Do you feel the proposed new system will provide sufficient information, and I'm just going to ask exactly the same questions that I did to the previous panel, so you've heard this before, to building owners to incentivise energy efficiency improvements and reduce emissions from their heating systems? So is this going to encourage people to make improvements to their homes?
Well, I think, first of all, it might well answer the questions that they want to be answered and that they're asking. I think that's really important because what we are certainly getting, I can obviously only speak from what we're hearing from our members. Our members are saying we want to improve the energy efficiency of our properties. It's an asset they want to invest in, and at some point they want to dispose of that asset. So it's important that not only are the tenants happy, comfortable in their homes, and that they'll want to stay in those homes because they're warm enough to live in and they can afford to live in them and heat, but also that there's a long-term capital appreciation of the property. So they're always thinking about improvements. One of the challenges we have at the moment is landlords will come to us and say, I need a new heating system in my property because it's getting to the end of its life. I don't know what to put in. 1 minute I'm hearing, go for gas, don't go for gas, go for electric. But that puts tenants off because it tends to be more expensive if you've got some of these different heating systems. So there's a confusion there, as to what to put in. And even from the tenant's perspective, you know, when they're looking around the property, they think, oh, actually, I can see it's electric storage heaters. And that puts people off because they think it's going to be expensive to run even though it might be more energy efficient. These are the conflicts that both landlords and tenants have when looking at different heating systems. And of course, these repairs, these renewals, these upgrades need to be done quickly. It's not something you can take time to investigate. If you've got a tenant in the property and the boiler breaks down, and that engineer says you need a new boiler, you need to do it now. So you can't go and look at all the different systems and you've got somebody living in the property. So there's all these challenges with that, and I think we can't lose sight of the reality. We've got both landlords and tenants, I'm sure, wanting to have more energy efficient homes. I don't really come across people that are against that idea, but they're thinking, how do we get from A to B? These are the challenges, and when? The biggest issue we have at the moment is landlords coming to us saying, I want to make energy efficiency improvements to my property. I don't know what to do. And if I do anything just now, before the regulations are laid before Parliament and agreed by Parliament, will they be suffice? Or am I going to have to spend yet more money doing something completely different? So these are the mixed messages and the confusion that's out there amongst both, as I say, landlords and tenants. So we need to tackle that issue head on.
A very simplistic answer would be no, it's not going to incentivise the change. Not in itself. And I think that's the key bit, not in itself. Understanding, again, come back to my point I made earlier on, what is an EPC and what's its purpose? And it is to give information at a point in time. And I can give you some recommendation of what you can do to make that improvement. But there was a lot of discussion in the earlier session about a dynamic EPC, about making things change. My position would actually be we actually need to put in some form of calculator online that lets people put in a system to say, actually, what's that difference going to make? If I do X, Y, and Z to my property, what's that going to impact in the cost I pay? So that could be used twofold, because the reality is most people are interested in what the cost of that's going to be, the payback period of doing that piece of work on that property. So you look at, I'm paying this at the moment, and if I put that in, I'm going to save Y. So if it's going to cost me this, then what do I then generate from that? That's fine, but actually the biggest impact on that's going to actually be your price of your tariff. So you might be better shopping around and changing your tariff. That'll have a bigger impact than your saving that you'll generate than spending £10,000 putting a heat pump in. So I think some form of free use calculator that's very simple to use. If you get this new EPC that tells you how many kilowatts per square metre per year you can use, and you put in what your tariff you're paying for your kilowatt hours at the moment, that'll tell you what your cost element is going to be. You could put a different tariff in, it'll tell you what that saving element would be. You could then have a drop-down menu, say I'm going to move from that heating system to this heating system. It'll give you an assumption of what that reduction in kilowatt hours per square metre per year would be, and it will tell you what that saving element again would be. So that, I think, in itself would give you a higher level of incentive than just EPC in itself. And like I said, we need to be careful that we're not trying to make the EPC into something that it's not. It is not a silver bullet to give you all the answers. It is a piece of information at a point in time of the type of, how well the house retains the heat, what type of heating system is being used to heat, and on average, for a generalised house, how much it's going to cost to heat that home. But as I said, that cost element is not accurate and it's not location specific.
Thank you.
Can I maybe come back on that point just slightly there? Sorry to take up time on this issue, but I think it's important that a big incentive is always the customer when it comes to a landlord renting a property. When EPCs come in, no tenant, no prospective tenant or existing tenant ever asked you about an EPC. They weren't interested. You would say, I've spent a lot of money doing this, here it is, and this is what it tells you. Okay, that's fine, but I just want to know where the property is, what does it look like, etc., etc. So now we're starting, I guess as a result of the cost of living crisis and fuel costs, tenants are now asking these questions. So they're now looking at the EPC. Maybe it's not, as I say, answering their questions, but they're interested in finding out more. So I think if we educate the public more, and that's us all, to understand the importance of these ratings, how can it be of use to us in our lives to make our lives better and more comfortable, then I think that will drive a change in the sector. And I think we're starting to see that. I can't speak for the social housing sector, but certainly in the private rented sector, we're starting to see that.
So we need to look more at education and how to make EPCs practical and user-friendly so
exactly.
that people understand what they can do.
And easily understood, and accurate as well too. So, as I say, a big issue that we have is that they're not accurate in the first place. And there's all these issues. I I don't want to go back to heat source pumps. I've got one in my own home, and if you ever want to do an evidence session on just them, I'm happy to come along and give you my personal experience, good, bad and indifferent. I don't regret doing it, but I don't have a warm, comfortable home anymore, as I did when we had gas central heating. That's a reality. So I need a backup source of heating. For me, that's an open fire. I don't see that as progressive. So how can we meet those challenges and have, obviously technology changes all the time, and hopefully that will continue to be the case. Even we've had a lovely summer. My heat pump still is on for hot water, so I need it for that. So I think there's a big debate out there about what is the right, and I guess for different properties it will be different solutions, different heating systems, and in different parts of the country, whether you're in our cities or our rural communities. So we're learning all the time, but we have to take the public with us in that journey and answer those questions as we go along.
Can we, Evelyn, if you can ask your next question and maybe direct it to Brian, because he wants to come in on this, so he can weave in what he wants to say and respond to your next question, that would be great.
That's fine. I was going to come to Brian anyway. It was touched on in the last panel about assessors being sort of generally in the central belt, not particularly rural. Are there enough assessors rurally?
For the current system, yes. I mean, we are quite a small housing association in Shetland. We have 4. We do about 70 EPCs per year on the current position, and that's sufficient for what we need. The bulk of the EPCs are being done by surveyors when they go and do a valuation on the property. That's where the bulk of that's being done. That property sale element, that movement, that's where the bulk of them's coming through. So in terms of our position, in terms of housing association, whether it's for social rent, and we do support for short-term lets, yeah, I think they're sufficient at the moment. The question is, EPCs are becoming more complex. Mm-hmm. So that move from RDSAP 2012 to now RDSAP 10, which we currently use, it's much more complex now of getting the data you need to get that EPC than what it was before. So it's taken longer. So it's the time allocation you need to make there that's a bit of an issue. It's taken for us about between an hour and 2 hours to do an EPC, but bear in mind we are in a rural location in Shetland, and I might need to get somebody on 2 ferries to get to the island I need to go to do that EPC. That takes, again, some additional time on that. But they are becoming far more accurate with that complexity. So measuring, I think, Andy touched on it in this morning session, measuring windows is a big issue. So having to go around and measure every window in the house, we didn't have to do that in the past. There was an assumption built into the software. That's been changed. The allowance to now build in, and this is a big one, to build in the air tightness of that property into your EPC assessment is a massive improvement. Because if you don't, the software within the EPC will make an assumption that there's 5 air changes in an hour. Now, if I do, I think it's actually 10, but if I do an air pressure test in that property and find out that the air tightness of that property is actually 2, then actually your EPC improvement is massive. So the more data we're adding into that, the more accurate it becomes. And that's the key thing. And I just touch on the heat pump. I've got a heat pump installed in my own house in exactly the same position. And understanding which house is suitable for a heat pump is very, very important, because air tightness is key to the performance of that heat pump. Because the heat pump operates at a very low temperature. It'll come back through about 45 degrees. Your radiators are not going to get hot, so you're not feeling it. It'll maintain that kind of standard heat. But if you're not retaining that heat in that home, it's just disappearing out of drafts and everywhere else that you've got, then the heat pump's got to work longer, it's got to work harder, and it becomes very expensive to run. So again, it comes back down to the recommendations within that. Coming back to your one on incentivisation, having the system online will be key. Now, I don't agree that somebody should be able to go in and change that, because people are trained. You know, it's not minimal training. We've got domestic energy assessors and significant training going into that, and the CPD is quite large as well. So I don't agree that they should be dynamic enough that they get changed. But what you should be able to do is access the data in behind it, because the EPC you get has fairly limited information on it. But if you're really interested in making improvements, if you're really interested in finding out how that result came around, getting that data in behind it is key. And I think that will probably incentivise people more if they understand where the readings have come from and understand where the measures are, and the data access becomes key to that.
Thanks for that. Do either of you have any views on the proposed new non-domestic metrics and assessment? Yeah, it's not for them.
A bit of flex on our time. I'm going to come to Alexandra Stewart and then I'll bring in Megan Gallagher.
Thank you. I want to go back to the quality of assessment and the assurance of governance when it comes to having the assessment. Now, we've already touched on today that there's a number of assessors required to carry out the work to make sure it's the case. And as a landlord, you want to make sure you've already indicated that you're getting the right assessment and you're doing the right things within that property. We believe we may have enough of them to cover that process, but there also may be some log jams in the system as we go forward as to how that is managed and how effective that is. And the success of this is very dependent on making sure that we have enough people to go out and make sure that individuals like yourselves are managing to fulfil the timescales and needs, because if you don't, then there may well be penalties that come later on from the whole process. So it would be good to get a flavour of what you believe are some of the areas where this assessment should work, or is it going to work in the timescales and the times that you want for your organisations and for your individuals who have that facility, or is it going to cause continued difficulty? And if it is going to cause difficulty to a landlord, then are they just going to sell up, as already has been said, because it's not worth the hassle of going through the whole process? It'd be good to... So maybe, John, if you start the process, we can then continue.
Yeah, I concur with that. I think, yes, it is a big challenge for landlords, regardless of where you are in the country. And obviously there's extra challenges in rural Scotland. But all of our members will say at some point or other, you will struggle to get tradespeople to be able to do any of these jobs. So whether it's upgrades, it's maintenance issues, back to our heat pumps, you try and get somebody to come and fix that. That is nigh impossible. That trade doesn't exist. They'll come and install it, but they won't repair it or maintain it. Absolutely. What's the point in having something that can't be repaired or maintained? And equally, I guess, with assessors as well too. If we need to make changes, and I know there's a proposal to change the time scale from 10 years to 5 years, that will be a big challenge. Absolutely. I don't know how we will achieve that in Scotland. So, and that will put perhaps an onerous burden on the sector to deliver that. So, again, it's back to, if we want people to do this, to improve the energy efficiency of our homes and achieve the decarbonisation agenda, we're going to have to make sure we've got the tradespeople, the skills and the knowledge in Scotland to deliver. I don't believe we're there yet.
Okay. Do you have a similar view, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to just the number of assessors and the training required, as we move through, and RDSAP changes all the time, as I said, we've moved from 2012 to RDSAP 10, we're now proposing to move to the home energy model. So our assessors are used to just changing that and getting that training. Now, we had this morning about 2,000 domestic energy assessors across Scotland. The question I don't think necessarily is, do we have enough assessors? Do we have enough trainers? Yeah. You know, how many training packages are we going to have to do? How often is that going to be? What length is that? A 3-day session, a 5-day session? Yeah. We need to understand actually what that is going to be to make sure that our assessors have the time, not just on the training element, but usually when they do these training, they've then got to do 3 or 5 test results that they send back into the authorising organisation. We use Elmhurst, who was on this morning. They then do an assessment on those 5 to then give you accreditation that you're allowed to then go out and start doing it. So it's not just as simple as getting your training and you go out and start doing it. You've then got, you know, as I said, you've got to do those assessments and test assessments to make sure that you have the skill element and you're getting the results out of that you'd expect to get out of it. And Elmhurst will delve into those 5 that you're doing fairly deeply to do the assessment. It comes back down to, I mean, I think within here, and we might be touching on this later, I don't know, is about the audit of that process. And there is discussion within the document and the proposal about that on-site audit. And again, we were hearing this morning some of that discussion. It doesn't have to be on-site. You can do modelling, you can do it by desktop survey, but that doesn't necessarily then fit around that audit process that you're trying to build into this as well. So do we want the audit process? What's the timescale involved in that? What's the cost involved in that? What's the purpose of it to a degree? And if we're going to allow that modelling element instead of an on-site assessment, then how do you do an audit on that? Because that's not going to be coming through. And particularly from a rural aspect, if we are going to say on-site audit is something that we want to see, well, does that mean my assessors have to wait until somebody flies to Shetland before they go and do an assessment, as opposed to just go to do it because they have time that day to go and do that assessment. I don't want to be losing time waiting for an auditor to come up. I think we touched on it. The person doesn't necessarily have to be there in person, but perhaps some sort of AI system to say, this is what I've done, this is the assessment I've carried out, and we work our way through. So I think the assessor element is a key question. We need to make sure they're up to speed. We need to understand that's going to take time. I was hearing Annie this morning saying about 6 months, he believes. I think that's reasonable if there is enough trainers to get us up to that degree. But we need to understand that once you've had the training, we've still then got to go and do the practical assessment at the back end of that.
And you've touched on the auditing and the assurance requirements that's going to be there. What are your views about how the Scottish Government have managed that and the plans that they've updated? Do you see that they are realistic or are they trying to be a bit more ambitious, or are these not going to be met in the timescales you think that they've set out so far?
Do you mean just on the audit process?
Yeah.
Or?
Just auditing and assessing the requirements.
Yeah, I mean, auditing, I think because we've been involved, like I said, I've been involved, I was a domestic energy assessor for 15 years. I'm just going to stop doing about 10 years ago. It wasn't as simple as, I mean, every one that you did effectively got assessed by Elmhurst as your authorised organisation. And if they felt there was a question in that, then they would come back and ask for enhanced auditing of that. And that might take another 2 hours to provide all the detailed information that you gathered onto that. So that audit process is there already. And I think what the Scottish Government are proposing, I think, is reasonable to a degree, that what they're asking for is an enhancement of the audit organisation. So it might just be a case of explaining what systems are in place to audit their assessors, as opposed to the audit of the assessors themselves. I suppose the other question I would ask is, somebody I think touched on it this morning, is do we need a level of qualification or is it a level of training? Sure. Well, I personally think the level of training is enough. I don't think necessarily you need to go to university to be able to do one of these things. But if you're going to have a level of training, there needs to be a set level of training. And I think our guys have all done 5 or 7 day training plus 5 practical assessments. I think that's reasonable. I think that gives you a good experience in terms of go ahead and doing it. I think doing a 1-day assessment course and saying I'm now qualified to do an EPC, I don't think that's sufficient. So I think there needs to be a bit more robustness in terms of the level of training that you're asking domestic energy assessors to have, and then that level of competence and experience can then be measured through your audit organisation.
And John, do you think the Scottish Government have got some of this right or not?
You wouldn't be surprised with me saying probably not. I think our biggest issue with regards to, and this is moving on to the proposed regulations in the bigger picture, is the timing. You know, we believe it is too ambitious. We're not against the principle. It's just how on earth are we going to get to the private rented sector to the state that the government wants by the 1st of April 2028? When we won't have some of these systems in place until 2028. I just don't understand that. Yeah. Now, as I say, I do understand that the Cabinet Secretaries and her team's looking at that, but that's what we've seen in the draft, as you have too. So I think we need to be more realistic with the timescales in order to just get everybody on board with the proposals. You know, nobody's coming out saying this is not something we should be doing. It needs to be measured, it needs to be proportionate, and it needs to set out and achieve what it's meant to do. And by putting unrealistic timescales on things, it's just not on.
And we touched on earlier about enforcement and penalties that maybe have to become part of this process as it expands and goes further. Have you got views on how that is going to operate? We heard earlier that some people felt that if it was going to be too much of an enforcement and there was going to be a penalty attached to it, then that would put people off. Yes, it would end up selling and not contributing to the process, and that would make the system potentially even worse.
Yes, exactly. And it goes back to a point made earlier. We need to be incentivising people to achieve these targets and improve their properties and make sure our housing sector in Scotland is the best it possibly can be, whether that's in the social housing sector, private housing sector or home ownership sector for that matter. Certainly a disappointment for us is that, so much is focused on the rented sector for a number of reasons, which, we can argue another time about, whether that's in the social housing sector or in the private rented sector. But there's a whole lot of properties there in the home ownership sector that are untouched by all of this. So, yes, you're quite right. It would be easy for a landlord to turn around and say, given all the other pressures that they have just now, let's just get rid of it. It'll get into the hands of a homeowner, perhaps, who doesn't need to bother about any of these things. That's an incentive not to do it. So we need to find a better way of communicating these messages and getting it right. And I think the timing is crucial. And I think what we're talking about is changing the timing by a couple of years. I think that's what we're looking at here. You know, many people, landlords in my sector, have been on this journey from way before COVID. We talk about everything in terms of COVID, but you'll know that just before COVID, well, we're looking at the regulations being introduced in 2020, and we were geared up for that. We were saying to our members, any improvements you make from the 1st of October 2019 will be taken into consideration. So some of them are doing that and have been doing that for years. They're now in the position of thinking, does that mean all the money I've spent in the past it's been wasted? So they're stalling now. So I'll be honest in saying, if they're asking us, what do we do to improve the energy efficiency of our homes that we rent out, we would say we can't tell you that. And actually, perhaps the best advice at the moment is do nothing. Now, that's not the message we want to be conveying.
No.
So, but we need to have the right information, and that's based on data, and we need to have the skilled workforce that can deliver for us when required.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. Over to Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. If I could start with the EPC validity time period, because the proposed reforms suggest that it's going to reduce from 10 years to 5 years. And in the last panel, John, I hope you don't mind, but I've raised the concerns that you've raised through the Scottish Association of Landlords in relation to this reduction. So if I could start with yourself in relation to those concerns that you have outlined, what would you like to see in terms of the proposed timeframe, the sticking with the 10, or is it this alternative proposal that you've outlined as well?
Yeah, so I think sticking with the 10 is what we'd be looking for. We feel it's important to maintain that. It's what landlords are used to. Remember, regulation and increased regulation costs, and those costs go up all the time. And ultimately, the people who have to pay those costs and the burden of those costs are the consumers, in our case, the tenants. So we don't want to be, yet again, putting greater pressure on rents to increase rents in the future. Then you need to think, well, what's the bigger public benefit to this? Well, the 10-year timescale, I think, is proportionate, and I think that's what we should be aiming for. Within that timescale, yes, you could be making an improvement to that property, a new heating system. That could well happen within a 10-year period. Could that happen within a 5-year period? I could imagine in many cases, in 5 years' time, you'll be doing another EPC and it wouldn't materially have changed, if at all. Now, what's the purpose of that? Just to get another EPC done. It's another bit of paper, as it were, another assessment, another cost. I think that's unfair, it's unnecessary, it's an undue burden on landlords. But in addition to that, I actually think it turns people off from the whole decarbonisation agenda. They'd be thinking, well, what's the point in this? Because it's just, at the end of the day, they'll just see it as another cheque that tells us no difference, nothing different to what was there before. The only thing that perhaps we could be looking at is new lets after the period of the MEES coming in the PRS. I could see a justification for that, but only with new lets. And then it's still the 10 years thereafter, because there'll need to be a period of time at which we catch up with the new system. But I can't see the point in changing it from 10 years to 5 years.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Brian, have you got any comments on the reduction of the validity timeframe?
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with John. I don't believe there's been a compelling case made of why we need to reduce it. I think there are prompts of when an EPC would be required, and I think those prompts would be sufficient. I think they can probably be strengthened a bit, to be honest. At the moment, they're at sale of property or re-let, or, well, if we're going to change or upgrade the heating system or the insulation level, maybe that should be a prompt that we need to do an EPC. You're probably doing it anyway, because there's a good chance you're getting a grant, and the grant will require a new EPC once that work has been completed. But maybe the prompts need to be strengthened, but I don't believe that there's been a strong enough case or a compelling enough case as why it needs to change from 10 years to 5 years. I don't know what benefit that kind of gives to tenants. I don't see what they're using that. The information that's on that's far more use to me as a landlord than it is to a tenant. So I'm not sure actually what the purpose of that would actually be. So we need to be careful on that as well. That if we do reduce that number, we need to understand that is going to impact on workload, it's going to impact on cost, and it's going to impact, particularly for us, in terms of staff time taken away on that. And I think I heard somebody earlier on saying that they believe that would then lead to a 30-odd% increase. We think it's going to be closer to a 50%, because we don't know necessarily how many people are going to be moving out of that property between year 5 and year 10 in terms of that increase. So we think there's going to be closer to a 50% increase in the number of EPCs that we're doing. And that, you know, for a small team, for a small organisation, could be significant. And if you're taking that across the board, it becomes even more significant. So we need to be careful what we're actually asking for and understand that each time we do these things, that cost has to be met by our tenants. That cost has to be applied back onto the rent. It needs to be met. And that is an ongoing issue, particularly in that rural areas where that travel distance is bigger and it becomes more of an issue for us to try and achieve it. So we do need to be careful on that. So I think if we can, personally, I would say you maintain it at the 10 years, but maybe increase or put in new prompts of when an EPC would actually be required within that 10-year period.
That's helpful, thank you. If I could stick with yourself, Brian, in the last panel session I raised the issues regarding rural properties and the significant challenges, the bespoke challenges in some instances that they have, given the type of housing, the structures, the age of properties, and trying to get those properties up to the current EPC standards that you would expect. It's usually very challenging for homeowners to actually do that without substantial costs being added to that. And again, we've discussed a lot today about how there might be a benefit in future years from the costs that you spend initially. But again, it's that upfront cost and whether that's actually affordable for people to do. So if I could stick with the rural landscape, you know, how challenging do you think that will be going through the EPC reform and perhaps any other pieces of legislation that's coming down the track as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the EPC reform is, like I said, on the whole, welcomed, and I think there's a lot in that that we're saying needs to come through. There's a few areas in there we need to maybe have a look at. The rural aspect is important. We do need to try and remember that it's the highest levels of fuel poverty, it's the poorest quality condition stock, and we need to remember that accessing grants becomes a bit of an issue because of the cost element. You have to remember, if I'm doing a piece of work in Shetland as opposed to doing that piece of work in Aberdeen, it's probably 40 to 50% more expensive. Purely because they've got to transport everything up there, the lack of labour, the lack of supply chain we've got in that kind of rural concept. So all that things need to be taken into account. And if you get your EPC that has a recommendation on it saying that you should change this and this is what the estimate cost will be, that's not anywhere close to reality in that rural aspect, nowhere close to that. But it sets that false impression. They're saying, well, a tenant's coming and saying, well, it says you can put this in for only that cost. We know that's not true.
Yes.
And that creates that unrealistic expectation, I suppose, from a tenant, and creates that saying, well, you're not doing it and you can afford to do it. Why are you not doing it? Well, it doesn't cost that. The reality is it costs probably 50% more expensive than that. And you know, our rent structure doesn't allow me then to increase my rent because you've got that new system back into it. So we have to be careful in terms of the information being provided in IPCs. We need to understand the rural aspect in relation to the supply chain, in relation to the cost of doing work. But equally, as you touched on, just the type of stock we've got is different. How spread out it is different. So again, comes back down to, if we take that for 10 years down to 5 years, just how spread out the stock can be will add significant time onto us doing these kind of changes to the EPC. So I think a lot of these changes need to be carefully considered within that kind of rural aspect. And I know we have the island impact assessment that should be assessed. So I would really implore Parliament to really have another look at that island impact assessment. I've been involved in quite a few of those, and it does, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it does feel like a tick box exercise because I've not seen any kind of detail coming out of that that's changed because of it, and I think that needs to be investigated again.
No, I agree, and again, Scottish Land and Estates and other stakeholders as well have called for that rural impact assessment. I think you're right in terms of your assessment there and making sure that if you're going to go down that route, that it is meaningful. And again, all of these areas are explored. But again, you know, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions there. But it was really good to hear your thoughts on that. If I can move on to the UK Scottish Government workings, should there be a closer working between the Scottish Government and the UK Government regarding EPC reform? Would that be better for landlords who have properties right across the UK to make sure there's some uniformity there? Or, you know, what needs to happen effectively to make sure that it is a successful implementation Brian or John, I don't know who
I'll
wants to come
quickly
first.
jump in on that. I think just understanding that most people will be interested in terms of if we're going to do work, what grants are available. And some of these grants are still controlled through Westminster, ECO being a kind of prime one on that. And understanding and having that commonality between the two sets it on an even playing field that you trying to access some of that ECO fund, and I think that's vitally important. I think, I don't know if this is the time to do it, but to kind of jump in, and I think we need to be careful with the recommendations on EPCs. At the moment, I think Andy touched on it this morning, they are a blunt tool, they give very blunt information, and he's absolutely right, they are. That's the purpose of it. And actually what we need to come, and I think John touched on it, the HEATSA coming through at the back end, I think becomes a critical piece of legislation. In terms of the requirement of doing that HEATSA, in terms of getting that more technical expertise and actually saying this is the recommendation we make for these sort of reasons, that you don't really get with the EPC, because the guys that are doing EPC are not trained to give that information. That's not what they're trained to try and do. So the HEATSA, I think, becomes a separate thing. But I think, again, we need to be careful that we're not getting the staff that are kind of doing the one, doing the other, that we're not doubling up the kind of assessments and people constantly in and out of people's houses. But the heat and energy efficiency technical suitability assessment, I think we'll stick to HEATSA, is an important tool for what we've got, how we make recommendations on that property to make sure they are technically feasible and actually have a realistic cost attached to them, because that's not what's in the EPC.
That's helpful, thank you, John. Again, going back to the Scottish UK Government workings, would that be easier for landlords that are working right across the country if there was a more aligned approach to EPC reform?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I think more so as well, it might improve the accuracy of the EPCs as well, and that data that's collected and shared. So really welcome that. I guess our concern, as we've made in representation, is with regards to the lead-in time. I think that needs to be, as we touched upon earlier, that needs to be, in our opinion, at least 2 years, so that we've got that time to be able to look at that. And that allows landlords to plan for these investments and upgrades and improvements and minimise disruption for tenants as well too. We need to think about that with long-term tenants. It's perhaps easier when obviously we've got empty properties, although you can't plan because you don't really know when a tenant's going to leave. But nevertheless, even if you get tenants in situ, it's difficult to manage. So you have to think of that disruption there. And obviously, when we're talking about rent, you know, there's pressures on rent in both the social rented sectors and in the private sectors for exactly the same reasons. All these things cost money, and ultimately they will be reflected in rents at some point. So we need to plan for all of these eventualities, both cost implications as well as the actual practical implications of the improvements.
Thank you. And then finally, although it's not directly linked to EPC reform, we've got the housing bill, which hopefully will complete this evening. Then we've got building standards, we've got heating buildings, although we are vastly running out of time to look at that legislation, and we've got EPC reform. It's all happening at the one time. Is there a danger that we're over legislating at present, and what impact do all of these things running at the same time have on, for example, landlords, tenants trying to navigate this very complex system with all of these changes, the costs associated with that, and actually, you know, just understanding what changes to legislation, regulations mean? I don't know who wants to start with that. I know it's a wide question, it's very open.
Yeah, if I may come in, yes, I think you've hit it in the head. You know, I think it's always important for us to review our legislation and make sure it's fit for a modern Scotland and it suits the people of Scotland. But we seem to be doing a lot at the one time in different aspects when it comes to housing, and in my case, the private rented sector. And there's a lot of mixed messages out there as well too. So we hear different stories, and that causes confusion, it causes concern. And I think certainly in my sector, representing private landlords, you have to always remember private landlords are first and foremost investors. Yes, they're providers of homes for people to live in, and that's important, and I think Scotland needs that and should be encouraging that, but they are investors. Yes. So if you frighten investors, then at some point they're going to think of it, hang on a minute, shall I continue to invest in the sector? Or actually, is now this the time when the tenant gives notice to leave? Is this the time to get out and invest somewhere else? And I think that's a concern for us, because we are, as we've made representations on, for a number of months now seeing landlords leave the sector for a number of reasons. But I think it's a combination of all of the above. So they are frightened about what the future might hold, the confusion that might cause for them. And remember, by far the majority of landlords are not institutional investors. They're not big landlords. They're landlords with just 1 or 2 properties. So this isn't their everyday job. And to try and keep abreast of all of this is very difficult. Obviously, they need to be a member of the Scottish Association of Landlords and to support them through that journey. But even for us, you know, this is a full-time job for us to keep in touch and up to date with all of this. So that's difficult for everybody. And I think with all of these things, I think they're well-intentioned, but we need to make sure that they're proportionate, well thought out, and achieve the aim that we all want at the end of the day.
Well, that's helpful. And Brian, yourself, please.
Yeah, as John said, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and you've not even mentioned the Scottish Equivalent Passive House Standard, you've not mentioned the Net Zero Standard, you've not mentioned the fuel poverty strategy, there's loads of stuff coming through. And it does feel endless at the moment, I'll be honest. I mean, the number of consultation documents you're doing pretty much on a weekly basis for the last 2 years has just been incredible. And there is a time and place for it. And there's some part of saying, well, if you do it all at once, then you don't have to worry about it again. And that's fine if you just leave us alone for a while after you've done it. But it just seems you get that in place and then the next route comes through. And we need to be careful that we're not putting overburdening some in terms of bureaucracy onto the sector as a whole, because you're just making it very, very difficult to get your, you know, to get comfortable where you need to try and get to. And all these sort of things, whether you like it or not, add layers of cost. And because they need to be assessed, the information needs to be back provided to the regulator. All this information needs to be gathered and accounted for, and the data analysis on that needs to be done. And the more and more you ask for, the more time it actually takes to come through. So we need to be careful on that. And there is that kind of feeling of exhaustion sometimes as yet another consultation drops on the floor. And we're waiting then to come through on, as I said, the Passive House Standard. What's that going to mean?
Yes.
And the Net Zero Standard coming through. And part of me is saying, well, it's fine, take it in, but at least give us an answer. It seems to be just swathing around within the walls of the building for a long, long time. And we don't know the timescale of when we're getting an answer on that. We don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. So the point John made earlier on is, what do we advise people to go ahead and do? Well, we don't know yet because the legislation is not there. We've not heard when that's coming through. We don't know why the delay's in that. And we don't know whether that's been looked at again to change what was in the consultation documentation. So it's the uncertainty as much as anything else. So after you've done the consultation, do you hear anything else come at the back end of it? So that kind of heat and buildings element, I think, is a key one, because that whole decarbonisation agenda is critical. But I think that can't be read in isolation. None of these things can be done in isolation because they all impact on each other. So you do an EPC assessment that makes a recommendation, but unless you do fabric improvement, then actually you're going to make that person that's maybe on gas moving into electric, move into fuel poverty. Well, that's going to impact on your fuel poverty strategy.
Yeah.
You then got your heat and building strategy coming through, or your heat and building bill coming in. Well, actually that's saying you need to be doing X, Y and Z, and it's looking at different aspects. But again, that will then impact on our ability maybe to meet the net zero standard and the timescale within that. So all these things are interlinked. And because they're all kind of coming at you from different angles, you're kind of going, well, I'll maybe wait. Same as what John said, I'll maybe wait until we kind of find out exactly what we're meant to do before we go off on, you know, down that kind of route, till a new piece of legislation drops and think, oh, God, we've gone the wrong way. And we're just wasting tenants' money in a direction we shouldn't be heading in.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, both. Thank you, convener.
Thanks very much. And that concludes our questions. My thanks for your contributions to the discussion this morning. And we are going to move on to the next item on our agenda, which is to consider the following negative instruments: Council Tax, Dwelling and Part Residential Subjects, Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025, SSI 2025/249, and Redemption of Heritable Securities, Excluded Securities, Scotland Order 2025, SSI 2025/251. Do members have any comments? No one has any comments. Does the committee agree that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments? We agreed. Thank you. So we have previously agreed to take the next item in private, so that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we will move into private.